The skin on a 2-day-old corpse doesn't feel like skin. It feels like a peach somebody left in the back of the fridge. Cold the whole way through, with just enough give that your fingers sink a little before they hit the stop. I know this because at 14 years old, in a stone room underneath a prison, a man in a mask told me to put my hand on one, and I did it. I had been alive in this world for about 9 hours. I had not yet worked out what happens here to people who say no. The kid whose body I was standing in had been 14 too. Same job, probably the same table. He put his hands on Asuna Spy's temples, went in after a memory somebody had already scrambled on purpose, and came back out with the lights off upstairs. He lasted 3 days after that. Then the Yamanaka clan buried him, and the Interrogation division did the reasonable, efficient thing and sent for the next 14-year-old on the family register. That was me. Hi. Nobody in the room was upset about it. That's the part I want you to sit with. There was no apology, no moment of silence, no senior ninja putting a hand on my shoulder and saying, "Kid, you don't have to." There was a corpse on a slab, a man with a clipboard, and a job that had an opening. The room was maybe 20 steps across, and it was cold the way a cellar is cold, from the floor up through your feet. 2 lamps, no windows because we were under the ground. The air had that flat mineral taste, like licking a coin. Somewhere behind the wall, water was going drip, drip, drip. It never stopped the entire time I worked there, and I never found out where it came from, and after about a month, I stopped hearing it, which honestly worried me more. Asato Shinji, the man with the clipboard, said, 14, chakra reserves below academy average, physical condition, and I'm reading this directly, poor. That's me, I said. He looked up. He had a scar going down through one eyebrow, and he was wearing sunglasses, indoors, underground, at night, which told me a lot about him immediately. This was Kenshin, the captain of the Interrogation division, and over the next year, he would become the closest thing I had to a big brother, mostly by accident and partly because I engineered it. The clan says you can perform the reading technique. The clan says a lot of things. Can you? Now here's my situation. About 9 hours earlier, I had been a guy in a normal world with a normal job, and then I was not. And instead, I was in a hallway in a ninja village with a headache and a full set of somebody else's memories sitting in my skull like unpacked luggage. I had the kid's face, his name, his chakra, his terrible lungs, and his clan technique. What I did not have was any experience using it, because the last time this body used it, it died. Yes, I said. He pointed at the slab. Then read him. The dead man was a Kumo intelligence officer named Kalen. He had swallowed something on the way in that scrambled his own neurons, which is a thing spies here carry the way other people carry keys, and he had done it well enough that 2 Yamanaka seniors had already gone into his head and come back with static. The Interrogation Division's plan for getting past that was to send in a sick 14-year-old and see what happened. I walked over. My hands were shaking, and I let them, because a kid who's about to do this should have shaking hands, and I was not yet good enough to fake calm. I put my palm on the top of his head, and something in the back of my mind went off like a till drawer. I don't have a better word for it. It wasn't a voice. It was the feeling of a machine somewhere behind my eyes closing a circuit it had been waiting 9 hours to close, and then a line of information landing in my head with the smugness of a slot machine paying out. Memory read successful. Reward acquired. Sage body. I stood there with my hand on a corpse in a room built for hurting people, and I felt every cell in my body get quietly, permanently upgraded. You know how you feel after you're sick for a week, and then one morning you wake up and you're not? Like that, except it kept going. My lungs, which had been doing a bad impression of lungs since I woke up, took a breath and got all the way to the bottom. The ache behind my eyes packed up and left. Something in my spine unclenched that I hadn't known was clenched. I had spent 9 hours in a body that felt like a rental car with the check engine light on. And now the engine was new, and it was not the engine that came with the car. Sage body. The thing sages spend 40 years in a mountain trying to build. I got it for touching a dead guy's hair. And right behind it, the whole of Kalen's life poured into me like someone had upended a filing cabinet over my head. Not scrambled, not static. All of it. Where he was born, his handlers, his route in. The exact reason Kumo had been so weirdly, patiently interested in the Hyuga clan for the last decade, which was that they wanted the Byakugan, and they were prepared to wait years for a clean chance at a child. his last meal, which was rice and pickled radish, which he did not enjoy. 2 senior members of my clan had gone in with a technique refined over generations and come back with nothing. I put a hand on his head like I was checking a kid for fever and got the man's entire life plus a permanent bodily upgrade. Cool. Very cool. Love that for me. So my very first decision in this world was made in that room, in about 4 seconds, and it's the decision the whole rest of this story rests on. I decided to be bad at this, because think about it for 1 second. What happens to the 14-year-old who walks out of that room and announces that he cracked a suicide-scrambled Kumo officer on the first try? He gets promoted, he gets famous, he gets put in front of every important skull in the village, and every enemy village puts a name and a face on a list, and within a year, he is either an asset the village cannot risk losing or a target somebody drops a building on. Either way, he stops being a person and becomes a resource. And the last kid who was a resource in this room lasted 3 days. I closed my eyes, I let my jaw go slack. I stood there with my hands on that corpse's temples for a full 30 minutes, sweating, breathing hard, occasionally letting out a little grunt like I was trying to move a wardrobe. Then I let my knees go and sat down hard on the floor. I got some of it, I said. Kenshin crouched down in front of me. Some of it. Fragments. It hurts. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Tell me the fragments." So I gave him the man's name, his rank, and the thing about the Hyuga, and I gave it to him in pieces, out of order, with gaps, the way you'd get it if you were an underpowered kid clawing through wet cement. I gave him about a fifth of what I had. I made sure the fifth was good enough to be worth keeping me around, and small enough that nobody would ever put me in a room with something that mattered. Kenshin stood up. He wrote for a while. I watched his pen. 2 jonin failed on this body, he said. I'm sorry. He looked at me over the top of the sunglasses, and I understood right then that the sunglasses were not for his eyes, they were for other people's. Don't apologize for succeeding. It's an ugly habit. Then he told me to go home and eat something, and I walked out of my first day at work with a permanent body upgrade, a dead man's entire life in my head, and a reputation as a promising but frail boy who tries very hard. I have never done a better day's work in my life. 2 days later, they brought me a merchant, alive this time. A round, soft man from the land of hot springs who traded in salt and had been arrested at the gate because a coded letter had turned up in the lining of his cart. He was sitting tied to a post in the little interrogation room they'd given me, sweating through a very nice coat, and he had the specific look of a man who genuinely does not know why he is here, which is a look you learn to recognize fast in that job. Please, he said, please, I'm a merchant. I've been coming here 20 years. Ask anyone at the North Market. I put my hand on his head. Ding! Transformation technique, just handed to me, wrapped, with a bow on it, an entire ninja art loaded straight into muscle memory. I knew the seals the way you know how to ride a bike, not learned, owned. And behind it came 20 years of a man's boring, decent life, and inside those 20 years was the answer, which was that he was telling the truth. He didn't know. Somebody in Kiri had been paying a man at his depot to slit the lining of his carts and sew letters inside them, and this fat, sweating salt merchant had been carrying enemy correspondence across 3 countries for 6 years and had never once known it. He was a mailbox with legs. So now I had 2 data points, and I sat there in a dark room with a terrified man tied to a post and did what any reasonable person would do, which is math. Reading a person gives me something, every single time. No cooldown I could find, no cost, no limit anybody had told me about. Which meant the interrogation division of Konoha, the place they send you when the village decides your life is basically over, the place with the leaking wall and the cold floor and the corpse table, was not a punishment posting. It was a buffet. Everybody they dragged through that door was a wrapped present with a person around it. Spies, thieves, ninja from 4 countries, and every so often a body they couldn't identify. Nobody in this village would ever wonder why a Yamanaka boy was in a room with his hands on somebody's skull. It was literally the job description. I had been handed the single greatest farming spot in the ninja world and a uniform that made using it invisible. I untied the merchant. I wrote up his confession, put the depot man's name at the top of it in big, clear letters, and told him to stop hiring family. He cried. I felt fine about it. It was a good day. The 3rd data point I did not plan, and it nearly killed me. I was in Kenshin's office, which had a desk and a lamp and about 900 scrolls, and I was trying to explain something I'd seen in the merchant's memory. Explaining a memory out loud is like describing a smell. You can go for 10 minutes and get nowhere. So I said, It's easier if I show you. And I reached up and put 2 fingers on his forehead, the way my clan transmits an image. Ding! Great fireball technique. An A-list Konoha fire technique, delivered directly into my skull from the captain of the Interrogation Division, whose head I had touched by accident in the middle of a conversation. And 30 years came with it. 30 years of interrogations. Every trick he'd ever used to break a man, every trick that had been used on him, the exact sound a professional makes when he's finally lying, the way to sit in a chair so the person opposite starts talking to fill the silence. 30 years of the most expensive education in the village, for free, because I wanted to save myself a minute of talking. I did not react. I want that on the record. I stood there with my fingers on my captain's forehead and my entire nervous system screaming, and I finished my sentence about the salt cart. But now I had Rule 2, and Rule 2 was the important one. The merchant gave me a technique. The corpse gave me a body. Kenshin gave me a technique plus 30 years. The reward scales with what the person is. Which means the ceiling on this thing is not the technique. The ceiling is who I can get my hand on. And that is the exact moment the obvious problem walked into the room and sat down. Because the natural next thought, the one you're having right now, is fine. Go touch the Hokage. Go touch one of the legendary 3. Walk up behind the strongest man in the village, tap him on the back of the head, and become a god by Thursday. Yeah, let me talk about that. First, it needs contact. Skin on the head. Not a handshake, not a shoulder, the head. And it turns out that the number of people in a ninja village who will let a stranger put a hand on their skull is exactly 0. Because in a ninja village, that is how you die. Every single adult in Konoha has a reflex about their head that a 14-year-old is not getting past. Second, I was 14. I weighed about as much as a wet coat, and the entire village believed I got winded walking upstairs. That belief was the most valuable thing I owned. The day I walk up to a jonin and reach for his head is the day I stop being a sick kid and start being a problem. And problems in this village have a way of not making it to breakfast. Third, and this is the one that actually kept me honest, I had a dead predecessor. This body's previous tenant died because somebody powerful needed a job done, and he was the cheapest way to do it. The lesson wasn't be stronger. The lesson was be less interesting. So the plan was not to storm the mountain. The plan was to stand at the bottom of the mountain with a cup and let the mountain come down to me one prisoner at a time, forever, while everyone in the village agreed that I was a sweet, frail boy who probably wouldn't see 30. 3 days later, they brought me one of our own. That was new. Everything up to then had been foreign, or civilian, or dead. This was a Konoha genin in a Konoha jacket with a Konoha plate on his forehead, 19 years old, name of Renji, and he had been picked up trying to leave through a service gate at 2 in the morning with a sealed scroll in his boot. He was not frightened. That was the first thing I noticed, and it was the whole case. Everybody who comes into that room is frightened. Even the professionals are frightened. They're just organized about it. This kid sat down on the post like he was waiting for a bus. They've made a mistake, he said. All right. I was doing a favor for someone. I didn't know what was in it. All right. He blinked. You're not going to ask me who. I'll get there. I put my hand on the top of his head, and I want you to know that at this point, I had done maybe 15 of these, and I still had not got used to the sensation of a whole person arriving. Ding! Water prison technique, which is a proper technique, a real one, the kind a genin should not have, because he wasn't a genin. He was Iwa. He had been placed in Konoha at 7 years old as an orphan through a refugee intake, which is a thing 3 of the 5 great villages were quietly doing at the time, and which is the single most efficient intelligence method ever invented, because you don't have to insert an agent if you can simply raise one. 12 years. 12 years of being a Konoha kid. Academy, team, missions, friends. There was a girl. There was a Jonin sensei he genuinely loved, and under all of it, once a season, a drop in a wall on the west side, and a life that was entirely a costume. That was the first floor. Then it got stupid, because 4 years ago, Kiri had found him. Not caught him, found him. Somebody in the hidden mist had worked out that the boy at the west wall belonged to Iwa, and they did not expose him. They went to him privately and explained the arrangement. The arrangement was that he worked for them now, and if he did not, a letter would arrive at the Konoha military police with his childhood in it. So for 4 years, Renji had been an Iwa asset run by Kiri, and what Kiri had him doing was the part that made me put my hand back on his head to check I'd read it right. They had him feeding false defensive intelligence about Konoha, not to Iwa, into Kiri's own reporting chain. Reports going up the mist's ladder saying that Konoha's northern approaches were thin, that the barrier had a fault, that a strike would find a soft village. Somebody senior in the hidden mist was building a case, on paper, for the 7 swordsmen to come and hit Konoha, and they wanted it to fail. That's a purge. That is somebody in the mist wanting 7 inconvenient monsters to walk into a village that is fully prepared for them and not walk out, and doing it with paperwork, using a stolen Iwa asset as the pen. I sat back on my stool, 19 years old, taken at 7 by one country, owned at 15 by a second, used as the instrument for an internal murder inside the second country's own military, aimed at a third. You're going to write all of it, I said. I don't know what you think you go to the west wall drop in the 3rd week of the season. It's the 4th stone up, left of the gate brace. You've hated it since you were 11, and you've thought about telling your sensei 900 times, and you've never got past the first sentence. I let that land. Renji, you are the least guilty person I have ever had in this room, and you are going to die anyway. So write it down and make it count for something, because the paper is the only part of you that gets out of here. He wrote for 2 hours. I wrote it up, and on the front of it, in my own hand, I put a note saying that, in my opinion, the subject had been recruited as a minor and had been under third-party coercion for 4 years. That was true. I already knew it would make no difference whatsoever. I put it there anyway. Kenshin read the whole thing standing up, which he never did. Then he laughed. Not a chuckle, a proper one, out loud, in a corridor, and I had worked for the man for over a month at that point and had never heard him make a happy noise. Kiri is trying to kill its own swordsman, he said, with our defenses, using Iwa's spy. Yes, sir. That's the best thing that's happened to this village all year. He tapped the report against his palm. How old are you? 14. You are the spirit of the interrogation division. Then he gave me a bag of coins as a bonus and told me to go outside, into the actual village, in daylight, like a person. I want to tell you about the ramen shop. I'd been under the ground for a month at that point. My whole experience of Konoha was a corridor, a cold room, and the walk between them. When I came up the stairs into the street that first afternoon, the light hit me like a slap, and I had to stand there blinking with my hand up like a mole. And the village was so much smaller than I expected, and so much louder. Kids running, somebody arguing about the price of fish, a woman beating a rug on a balcony, nobody dying anywhere. It was extremely disorienting. I followed the smell. Ichiraku was 8 seats under a cloth flap, and it was run by a young guy named Hiroshi, who had not yet grown into the face he'd have later. He took one look at me and started cooking before I sat down, which I later learned was not hospitality, it was a professional read. He'd clocked that I hadn't eaten properly in a while. I was 3 bites in when somebody sat down next to me and said, "Shinji?" And here's the thing about wearing somebody else's face. You don't get to choose who recognizes it. He had blonde hair sticking up in every direction, and the kind of open, uncomplicated face that makes you instantly suspicious in a village like that one. My predecessor's memories put a name on him before I could stop them. Academy, same year. The kid who used to wait for him after class because he was slow and who never once made it a thing. Haruto. "It is you," he said, and he was so pleased about it that I had a small crisis. "Nobody's seen you in a month. They said you got put in the interrogation division." They did. "Are you okay?" Nobody had asked me that. Not the clan, not the division, not the man who handed me a corpse on my first day. A blonde kid in a ramen shop asked me that between mouthfuls because it genuinely occurred to him to. "I'm fine," I said. Then the woman on his other side leaned around him to get a look at me, and she had red hair down her back and a face like an argument you're already losing. "He's not fine, he's gray," May said. "Look at him. He's the color of a wall." "That's just his face." "That's a terrible thing to say about your friend." "I meant it nicely." I sat there eating noodles while these two conducted a full domestic dispute about the color of my skin, and something in my chest did a thing I had not authorized. Because I had a plan, and the plan was to be nobody, and nobody has no friends. Friends are handles. Friends are the thing an enemy grabs when they need to move you. I had spent a month building a life with no handles on it, deliberately, like a smooth stone. And here was this idiot buying me an extra egg. I paid for all 3 bowls. I want you to understand that I did this on purpose, as an investment, and that I have never once been able to make that explanation sound true, not even to myself. May said I was gloomy. Haruto said Unbu are supposed to be gloomy, it's the whole point, and defended me at length to a woman who could not have cared less, and I walked home in the dark with a full stomach and the distinct sense that I had just made a serious tactical error and was going to do it again. There was a tail on me the whole way. 2 roofs back, no killing intent, staying on my left. Kenshin's, obviously. He'd been having me followed since day one. I decided I liked that about him. A man who checks is a man who has thought about the problem. 12 days later, they laid 23 children on straw mats on the floor and told me to go through them. Not corpses, children, 6 to 11 years old, all of them war orphans, all of them collected off the roads by an outfit that had been quietly seeding kids into 3 villages for years. Konoha's counterintelligence had rolled the whole operation up, and now there were 23 small people on the floor of my department, and somebody had to work out which ones had been trained and which ones were just kids. I read all 23. It took most of the day. They didn't give techniques. Small children don't have techniques. What they gave was chakra, little bumps of it, and something the readout called spiritual power, which, as far as I could tell, was the thing that lets a Yamanaka push into somebody's head without getting lost in there. 23 of them stacked up into a real difference. I could feel it by the end of the day, sitting behind my eyes like a wider door. So, 3rd rule. The reward matches the person. Weak person, weak reward, but never nothing. Never once nothing. The reading itself was the worst day I had that year, and I include everything that came later. Because when you read an adult, you get an adult. Structure. Order. A man's life comes at you as a case with a lid on it. A 6-year-old's memory is not organized at all, it's just weather, and it arrives as a smell and a shape and a feeling with no words on it, and you cannot do anything with it except experience it. Number 9 had watched a house burn with people in it, and had no idea whose house. He just had the picture. It didn't come with a name, because at 4 you don't get told names. Number 14 had walked a road for 11 days. That's the entire memory. Road. Number 17 was a girl called Akari. She was 9. Akari had watched her village come apart from inside a water barrel with the lid on, one eye at the bunghole, for 6 hours. She did not make a sound the entire time. She came out of that barrel with the single most useful skill in the ninja world, which is the ability to be perfectly still while something terrible is happening 4 feet away. She was good at it because she'd had to be, at 9, once, and now she could do it forever. I sat on the floor between the mats afterwards for a long time. Then Kenshin came in and told me to pick 6. 6 for what? 6 to keep, the rest go to the orphanage. I looked at the 23 kids on the mats. I already knew everything about every one of them. I knew which ones cried at night and which ones had already learned not to. I knew that a girl on the ends named Akari had watched her village burn from inside a water barrel and had come out of it able to sit perfectly still for 6 hours, which is a talent and a terrible one to have at 9. And I understood the test, because Kenshin wasn't asking me to pick the 6 best. He was watching to see what best meant to me. If I picked the 6 most loyal, I was a soft one, and soft ones get eaten in that building. If I picked the 6 most talented, I was ambitious, and ambitious ones get watched. If I picked the 6 most broken, I was cruel, and cruel ones are useful, but you never turn your back. I picked the 6 I would not be able to lie to. The 6 most cautious. Not the 6 most loyal, not the 6 with the most chakra, and not, I want to say clearly, the 6 I lated. The ones who checked doorways, the ones who ate slowly, because a child who eats slowly is a child who has learned that the food might be a trick. The ones whose memories were full of counting exits without knowing that's what they were doing. Akari was one of them. Of course Akari was one of them. I put the 6 in a row, and I told him why. These 6 will never be turned, I said. Not by Kiri, not by Eva, not by us either, which is the part I'd think about. If you're going to grow enemies in your own basement, you may as well grow the paranoid kind, because the paranoid kind can't be recruited by anybody, including the man who recruited them. Kenshin did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "You understand that means these 6 will never trust you." "Yes, sir. You picked them anyway. You asked me to pick 6 who'd be useful. You didn't ask me to pick 6 who'd be fond of me." And he wrote something on the clipboard, and I would give a lot to know what it said. Then he said, "The perception team needs a squad leader," and I said no. I want to be clear about the speed of it. He had not finished the sentence. The word no was out of me before the word leader had finished landing, and I heard myself do it and had a small internal moment of horror, because that is not how a 14-year-old reacts to a promotion. I had his 30 years in my head, and inside those 30 years was a specific afternoon 11 years earlier. The last man to hold that post carried up the stairs on a board, eyes open, nothing behind them. There was another afternoon 9 years before that one. Same board, same stairs. Both of them had been better readers than me. The perception team's squad leader is the man they point at the hardest heads in the village. It is a chair that eats people, and the reason it was empty was not that nobody wanted it. "Why not?" he said. So I coughed. It was a genuinely excellent cough. I'd been building it for a month, off the memory of a man with a lung condition I'd read in week 2, and it had a wet edge at the end of it that I was extremely proud of. "I'm not strong enough, sir." "That isn't the job. I'd hold the team up. I take 20 minutes on a fresh corpse. If somebody's waiting on me in the field," Shinji. "I like the small room," I said. And that was the true one, and he heard that it was true, and it confused him more than anything else I said, because in his entire life, nobody had ever refused that chair by explaining that they liked their room. He looked at me for a long, long moment. Then he walked out and did not speak to me for 10 days. 10 days, not a word. He passed me in the corridor 4 separate times and looked straight through me, and on the 6th day, I watched him stop and speak to a man 2 feet to my left, and then walk off without ever once acknowledging that I was standing there. Most people in that position would have cracked by the 3rd day. It is a genuinely brutal technique, and he'd used it on prisoners, and I know that because I had the memory of him using it on prisoners. I sat in my little room and mined him like a man with a claim and a shovel. 30 years. How to build a rapport with a hostile man inside 11 minutes. How to tell when somebody is lying about a person they love, which is a completely different tell from how they lie about anything else, because they get slower instead of faster. What to do when a subject starts to enjoy it, which happens more than you would like, and which is the one situation where you stop and hand him to somebody else. The 9 methods he had been taught, the 3 he actually used, and the reason he had stopped using the other 6, which was a man in the Second War who had given him a full and detailed confession under one of them, and had turned out 4 months later to have been in another country the entire week. On the 11th day, Kenshin stopped by my door. He said, "Good, that's it. That is the entire conversation." 10 days of freeze-out, and then 1 word from a doorway and the sound of him walking off down the corridor. I sat there with a pen in my hand and worked out what had just happened to me. He hadn't been punishing me, he'd been finishing the test. Because a boy who turns down a promotion might be modest, and modesty is common and boring. But a boy who turns down a promotion and then gets frozen out by his captain for 10 days and does not chase him, does not sulk, does not send a note, does not corner him in a corridor to ask what he did wrong, and in fact does not appear to have noticed he is being punished at all, is a completely different animal. Because that boy is not humble. That boy does not need anything from you. He had gone looking for what I was, and he had found the edge of it, and he had written down exactly the right observation and drawn from it exactly the wrong conclusion. He decided I was a young man with no ambition. He would keep believing that for another year, and it would keep him alive, and I made very sure that believing it stayed more comfortable than the alternative. 2 weeks after that, they gave me a mask. A cat. White porcelain, black lines, a little smile painted on it. The stores had run out of everything else, and the quartermaster shrugged and said, "Cat's all we've got, kid." I put it on and looked at myself in a window. I didn't know yet that within a year there would be criminals in 3 districts of this village who would rather do the extra 6 months than end up in a room with that face. I didn't know that people would call it the cat-faced demon, or that they'd tell each other it ate a man in front of an audience, which never happened and which I never once corrected. At the time, I just thought, well, at least it's not creepy. It was extremely creepy. It's the smile. The smile is the whole problem. That same week, the interrogation division had its full meeting, everybody in one room, which happened about twice a year. Kenshin stood at the front with a scroll he never opened and said one thing that I want you to hold on to, because everything after this hangs off it. He said, "Inside 3 years, we are going to be at war." Nobody argued. That's what got me. 40 professional liars in a room, and not one of them said, "Don't be dramatic." 3 years. That's what the smartest man in that building thought he had. He was wrong about the 3 years. He was not wrong about the war. The man who came for me next was called Daichi, and I should have killed him the first day I met him, and I want you to remember later that I'm the one who said that. He ran the perception team, which is the polite name for the Yamanaka who go into heads professionally. He was about 60. He had that dry, papery look that men get when they've spent 40 years indoors doing something bad, and he came into my little room without knocking and sat down on my stool like it was his stool, which, fair, it probably had been at some point. "So you're the new one." "I'm the new one. They tell me you're weak." "They're right." He liked that. I watched him like it. Old men in that building love a young man who agrees with the worst things said about him, because it saves them the trouble of establishing it. "Corpses," he said. "From now on, you do corpses. The living ones go to people who can hold a technique for more than 10 minutes. Now, in his head, this was a demotion. He was putting the sick kid on the dead pile so the sick kid would stop wasting a room. In my head, a man had just walked in and offered me an unlimited supply of the only resource I cared about, with no witnesses, no questions, and no upper limit on how many I got through in a day. I did the face. I looked at the floor. I said, "Yes, sir," in the voice of a boy who has just been told he's not good enough. He stood up to go, and then he stopped in the doorway and said something that I have thought about a lot since. "Shinji, do some running." "Sir?" "You're going to die in here. Not because somebody kills you, because your heart gives out at 22 on a staircase and nobody notices for 2 days. He wasn't being cruel, that's the thing. He said it the way you'd tell someone their shoelace is undone. "Do some running." Then he left, and I sat there in the dark thinking, that is genuinely the kindest thing anybody in this village has said to me, and I am going to have to use it to build my disguise. Because here's my problem at that point. Sage Body was 2 months old, and I was getting stronger by the day, whether I wanted it or not. I could feel it. I'd started sleeping 4 hours and waking up finished. I could go up the prison stairs at a jog and arrive at the top not breathing. And a 14-year-old who is visibly getting healthier, in a building full of professional observers, is a 14-year-old with a story he's going to have to tell eventually. I needed the village to watch me try to get stronger, and fail, publicly, and give up. So the next morning, I went out to the training ground behind the division at the exact hour I knew people would be there, and I ran. I ran badly. That's an art form, by the way. Running badly on purpose is harder than running well. You have to keep the stride short and let the arms cross the body, and the breathing has to come apart before the legs do, because that's the order it happens in for real. 3 minutes in, I went down. Not a graceful stumble. I let the knees fold, and I hit the dirt on my hands and stayed there, and I did the breathing, the horrible whooping kind, and I let it go on much longer than felt comfortable, because amateurs stop too early. There was a man watching from a window on the second floor. I knew there was a man watching from a window on the second floor because I'd checked the sightlines the night before and picked my collapse point to be centered in that window, like a portrait. It was Kenshin. Of course it was Kenshin. I found out weeks later, out of somebody else's head, what he wrote in the file after that. He wrote that the boy has no physical future and should not be considered for field work under any circumstances. Best sentence anybody has ever written about me. I'd have it framed if I could. I lay in that dirt for a while, wheezing, with the entire architecture of my next 10 years locking quietly into place around me. And then I got up and went to work and put my hands on my first pile of dead people. The corpse room was down one more level than my room, which I hadn't known there was. 12 slabs, 9 of them full. The cold in there was a different cold, a worked cold, coming out of seals cut into the walls, and it smelled of the stuff they pack bodies in, which is sweet in a way that makes you want to leave. The clerk on the door handed me a clipboard and said the intake numbers didn't match the tags, and could I count them? Could I count them? I want to be very clear that I did not laugh. I said, "I'll count them," and I walked down the row of the dead, putting my hand on the top of every single head, one after another, the way you'd count sheep through a gate. It went off in the back of my head 9 times in about 40 seconds, like somebody walking down a row of light switches. 9 bodies, 7 techniques, a wind release, 2 earth, something Kiri had for making mist that sticks to the inside of your lungs. A sealing method I didn't understand for another 4 months. 9 complete lives poured into me in about 40 seconds, in the dark, while a clerk outside the door leaned on the wall and picked at a thumbnail. Then I sat down on the floor between the slabs and stayed there for 20 minutes. That was the job now, not reading. Reading took a second and a half. The job was the 20 minutes afterwards, sitting on a cold floor pretending to be a boy fighting his way through a dead man's neurons, because the reading was free and the alibi wasn't. I did 4 more sets that afternoon, a dozen bodies, and somewhere around the 8th one, I noticed the thing that eventually got a lot of people killed. They had all died the same week, 9 of them, different ages, different crimes, different districts, 1 week. And every one had that same look on the inside, the specific memory shape of a man who went to sleep in a cell and simply did not have a next thing. Poison. Obviously poison. You don't need 40 years in a basement to get there. So there I was, 14 years old, sitting on a mortuary floor with the private, uncheckable knowledge that somebody in this village was killing prisoners in their sleep, and my entire strategy for staying alive was built on being a boy who notices nothing. The truth about this village, which I had already worked out, and which took the adults around me another year to say out loud, is that it is not a bright place with dark corners. It's a dark place that keeps a very good garden out front. I went home. I ate. I waited until the small hours. And then I went out into the trees on the north edge, and I ran for 2 hours without stopping. And at the end of the 2 hours, I was not tired, so I did 3,000 press-ups to see if that would do it, and it did not. And I stood in a clearing at 4 in the morning, genuinely a bit unnerved by my own body. Sage body doesn't make you strong. That's the thing people get wrong. It makes you not spend anything. Ordinary bodies are buckets with a hole in them, and every day you pour effort in, and most of it runs out the bottom. Mine had no hole. Everything I ever did to it stayed. 2 hours of running went in and never came back out, and the next day I started from the new number. Which meant the only real limit on me was time and the willingness to be boring, and I had a great deal of both. I was walking back through the trees at about 5, extremely pleased with myself, when I walked directly into Kenshin, soaked, steam coming off him in the cold. He'd been out there doing exactly what I'd been doing, at exactly the hour a man does it when he doesn't want to be seen doing it. We both stopped. Shinji. Captain. He looked at me for a long moment. I was not out of breath, which was a problem, so I bent over and put my hands on my knees and let some out, and I hated every second of it. Couldn't sleep, I said. I thought I'd try what Daichi said, about the running. How did it go? I did about 4 minutes, he nodded slowly, and then he did something I did not expect, which is that he sat down on a log in the wet at 5 in the morning and gestured for me to sit too, and he talked for about half an hour about nothing in particular, about his knees, about a man he'd interrogated in the Second War who'd asked to write a letter and then written it to a woman who'd been dead 9 years and never known it, about his boy, Ibiki, who was small and stubborn and who apparently had a horror of vegetables that Kenshin discussed like an ongoing military campaign. I did not read him. I want that noted. I had my hand right there on the log next to his shoulder for half an hour, and I did not do it, and it wasn't strategy, and I've never been fully comfortable with the fact that I can't tell you why. At the end of it, I said something stupid. I said I intended to serve the interrogation division for 80 years. Kenshin laughed so hard he had to take the sunglasses off. 80 years? I'm going to be the oldest man in that building. Shinji, you'll be lucky to make the stairs. Then I'll be the oldest man on the stairs. He put a hand out and I flinched, and he caught it before it landed and turned it into a wave instead. And I remember thinking, he will not even pat my shoulder in case something snaps. I built that. I am extremely proud of it. It also makes me feel like something scraped off a shoe. The dead prisoner thing solved itself in the worst possible way, which is that it stopped. For 6 weeks, the bodies came in. Then one Tuesday at lunchtime, the case closed. Not solved, closed. A notice went up on the board with 3 lines on it saying the matter had been reviewed and no further action was required, and by dinner, nobody in the building was talking about it. I read the notice twice, and then I went back to work, because I had learned the single most important survival skill in Konoha, which is that when a door closes, you say, "Oh, a door," and you walk past it. Except I already knew. Because I'd been counting the dead the whole time, and I'd noticed the shape of it, and the shape was this. Every man on that table had been within a month of release. Not the dangerous ones, not the spies, the ones about to walk out the front gate and go back to their lives with a head full of the inside of a Konoha prison. That's not murder, that's inventory control. They gave me my own cubicle after that, which is what passes for a promotion down there. A stone box with 2 posts in it and a stool, and from then on the guards brought me the living ones. My first customer was a man named Takahiro Morita, who had stolen 11 eggs. 11, I asked. He'd taken them off a stall over 3 weeks. He had a whole story about being framed by his neighbor, and he told it very well, with a good bit in the middle about the grudge. While he was telling it, I put my hand on his head and watched him take all 11 eggs. You took them on the 4th, the 9th, the 11th again, and then 7 on the 16th because the stall was unattended and you panicked, I said. He stopped talking. Memory doesn't lie, I said. You do. It doesn't. That line got out of the building somehow. I heard it repeated back to me 8 months later by a man who was terrified of me and had never met me, in a completely different district, with the details wrong and the sentence perfect. That's how the cat-faced demon started. Not violence. One line to an egg thief, and a mask with a smile painted on it. For the next 8 months, that room was my classroom, and the entire criminal population of Konoha was the syllabus. And I want to talk about the year in that room, because everybody thinks the interesting part of this story is the killing, and it isn't. The interesting part is the 8 months of Tuesdays. They brought me everything. They brought me a woman who had been running a protection racket out of a flower shop for 6 years, which is genuinely inspired, because who searches a flower shop? They brought me a man who kept letting his neighbor's dog out, deliberately, for 11 months, over a boundary dispute about 9 inches of fence. They brought me pickpockets, 3 of whom were children, and 1 of whom was extremely good and is probably still working. They brought me a man who had put a rock through the window of the man who had married his wife, and who cried in that room for 40 minutes, and whose memory was the loneliest thing I have ever been inside. And every single one of them handed me a bump of chakra, or a little widening behind the eyes, and their entire life. Which is the thing nobody understood about my job, including me, for the first 3 months. The Hokage of this village got reports. He got summaries written by people who had decided in advance what was important. That is a perfectly good way to run a country, and it means you are always, structurally, 1 step behind everybody. I got the raw feed. I knew which streets the Uchiha police walked twice a night, and which ones they had quietly stopped walking, and more importantly, I knew that the people on those streets had noticed. I knew which of the 3 gate captains could be talked round, and which one could not. I knew about a gambling house behind a laundry on the south side, and I never reported it, because a gambling house behind a laundry is where you go when you need to know something, and burning it would have been like burning a library. And I watched the Uchiha thing get worse, month over month, from the inside of ordinary people's heads. Nobody hated them. That's what everybody gets wrong about it later. In month 1, an ordinary Konoha citizen felt about the Uchiha police roughly the way you feel about a locked door. By month 8, the same kind of person had a story. Not a big one, a cousin who got spoken to, a stall that got moved, a night somebody knocked. Because the village had done a very clever administrative thing years earlier, which was to make one family responsible for arresting everybody in it. And then the village acted amazed that everybody had feelings about that family. You cannot make a clan the hand that grabs people and then be surprised when the village flinches at the sight of them. I sat in a stone box under a prison and watched that resentment come up a wall like damp, one small ordinary grievance at a time, for 8 months, in 140 separate heads, and there was nothing whatsoever I could do about it except take notes. By the end of it, I knew this village in a way that I do not think the Hokage did. Because the Hokage got reports, I got the actual thing. I knew which streets the Uchiha police walked twice a night, and which ones they never walked. I knew that the Uchiha had started being resented, and I knew exactly why, which is that the village had made one clan responsible for arresting everybody in it, and then acted surprised when everybody hated that clan. I watched that grievance get bigger inside strangers' heads, month after month, like water coming up a wall. And then one afternoon they brought me a man arrested for defamation. Defamation. In a ninja village. He'd been drinking, and he'd said something about the higher-ups in a room with the wrong ears in it, and the specific something was that his cousin had been due for release last winter and had died in his cell. I put my hand on his head with absolutely no expectation, and I got the whole thing, because the cousin had told him, before he died. The cousin had been a trustee, one of the ones they used to carry food, and the cousin had seen the warden of Konoha prison take a small dark bottle out of a drawer and walk down the release wing with it. Then he had been stupid enough to say so out loud to a family member on visiting day, and the warden had not made that decision. The warden had a memory too, and it was sitting right there in the cousin's account of what the warden said when he was drunk 2 weeks later, which was that he was following an instruction, and the instruction had come from the old man with the bandaged face. Kageyama. I sat in that room with my hand on a man's head and did not move for about 10 seconds. Every prisoner due for release, every one. Not because they were dangerous, because a man who has been inside Konoha's prison walks out with a head full of Konoha's prison. And there is a man in this village whose entire professional philosophy is that the cheapest lock is the one you don't have to build. And now 3 people knew. The warden, who was following orders, this drunk idiot in front of me who had inherited it from a dead cousin, and a 14-year-old boy in a cat mask. Now, what does a hero do here? A hero takes it upstairs. A hero writes it down and puts it in front of the Hokage and lets the light in. Let me tell you what happens to that boy. That boy's report goes up the chain, and somewhere on that chain it passes a desk belonging to a man who has been running the quiet half of this village since before the boy's parents met. And then the boy has an accident, and the report has an accident, and the drunk has an accident, and the file gets a 3-line notice on a board saying the matter has been reviewed. So here's what I actually did. I took my hand off his head, I got him a cup of water, and I said, "You're going to write a confession that says you were drunk and you insulted the village council, and you're sorry. You're not going to write your cousin's name. You're not going to say the word prison. And when you get out of here, if anybody ever asks you about your cousin again, you're going to say he was sick." He stared at me. He wasn't sick. I know. They killed him. I know. Then why? Because, I said, there are 2 ways this ends. In one of them, you say his name out loud one more time and you join him. In the other one, you say he was sick and you go home, and there is one person left alive who knows what actually happened to him. I pushed the paper across. Him being remembered is the only thing you've got left. Don't spend it on a room like this. He cried for a while. Then he wrote it. I filed it, and I signed it, and I sent him home, and I never saw him again. And as far as I know, he's still alive, which puts him ahead of nearly everybody else in this story. And I went back to my stool and sat down in the dark and thought, all right, so that's who Kageyama is. Not a villain in a tower, a man doing the sums, a man who looked at 40 prisoners about to walk out with information in their heads and worked out that the cheapest solution was a bottle, and swept fine, and would do it again, and probably had. Get on with your work, Shinji. Keep your head down. Read the dead. Get strong. Stay boring. That was the plan. It survived about 4 more months. Daichi came back on a Tuesday and asked me for help. And the thing about Daichi is that he never asked anybody for anything, so I said no before he'd finished the question. You don't know what it is yet. I know I'm not doing it. He sat down on my stool again. He'd gone thinner since the last time. The papery look had gone from papery to something worse, and there was a color under his eyes that I recognized from about 40 corpses. There's a matter, he said, that the division would like handled quietly. Then it should go to somebody quiet. You are extremely quiet, Shinji. I'm sick. You're always sick. That's my point, sir. I'm consistently sick. It's my whole thing. He tried 3 more times over the next week. Each time he got a little more direct, and I got a little more pathetic, and it turned into a kind of duel where he'd walk in with a new angle and I'd have a new symptom ready. The 4th time, he came in and sat down and said, flat out, "Boy, you're going to help me whether you want to or not." And I said, "Sir, I can't. It's that time of the month." There was a silence in that room that I would frame if I could. Daichi was 60 years old. Daichi had personally taken apart men from 4 countries. Daichi had a face like a filing cabinet and had not shown a human expression in my presence once. And the man went gray. He stopped. He started again. I'd really rather not discuss it, sir." He left. He actually left. He got up and walked out of my interrogation room and did not come back for 11 days. And I sat there in the dark under a prison and laughed until I had to hold the wall. Look, I'm not proud, but I want you to appreciate the engineering. There is no follow-up question. There is no senior officer alive who is going to press a 14-year-old on that. I had found the one sentence in the entire ninja world that a man like Daichi cannot get past. And I want it noted that it worked better than anything else I tried all year. When he did come back, he'd got worse. Not annoyed, worse. The color under his eyes had moved out and taken over his whole face, and he came in without the stool routine and stood in my doorway, holding the frame. "People are going missing," he said. I put my pen down. "Not ninja, civilians. 16 this year. They go out for work and they don't come back, and there's no body, no blood, nothing at the house. The security division has it filed as runaways." He looked at me. 16 runaways, Shinji. And here's the horrible part. The part I've never told anybody until right now. I already knew what it was. Because I'd read 140 people in that room by then, and one of them was a nobody arrested for breaking a window. Months earlier, that man had walked home the wrong way one night and seen 2 masked men carrying something long and wrapped between them. He had been sensible. He looked at his own feet and kept going, and the thing they were carrying went in through a door in a hillside, in a place where there is no reason for a door. I knew there was a laboratory under this village. I knew who ran it. Everybody in this story finds out eventually, and it is always the same answer, and the answer is Orochimaru. And I knew who let him. Same man with the bandaged face who had been signing off on bottles in the prison. "Sir," I said, "let it go." "I can't." "You can. It's very easy. I've been doing it for months. It's mostly just deciding to. 16 people. And if you find out where they went, it'll be 17. I stood up, which I almost never did. "Sir, whoever's doing this is somebody the Hokage cannot arrest. You already know that because it's been going on for a year in a village that solves murders in a day. So the only question left is whether you'd like to be told to stop or shown. I have gone over this 100 times since. I said the right words. I said them clearly, and I said them early. And I said them to a man who had every professional reason to listen. He asked me to come and have tea. The tea house was up on the east side, one of those places with 4 tables and an old woman who has decided that customers are a personal insult. Daichi sat across from me and poured and did not drink any, and for about 10 minutes he talked about nothing. His wife, who'd died, a trip he'd taken, the tea. Then he said, "Do you know what the interrogation division is for?" "Getting the truth." "No." He turned his cup around on the table. "The interrogation division does not want the truth. The interrogation division wants an answer. An answer is a thing you can put in a file and close. The truth is a thing that keeps being true after you've closed the file, and no organization on Earth has any use for that." I didn't say anything. 40 years, he said. 40 years of answers. And I am dying, boy, in case you were being polite about it. And I have started to notice that not one of the answers was true. And I looked at that old man across a teapot, and I felt something that I want to be honest about, which is that I felt sorry for him. And I also thought, this man is going to get me killed. Both. At the same time. That's what it's like, being the smartest person in a room full of people who are about to do something noble. 3 days later, Daichi died. I got the word at the division. Collapsed in the street, they said. Heart. 60 years old, 40 of them in a basement. Nobody was surprised. They had him laid out in the room I'd been counting bodies in for 8 months. And I went down there, and I stood over him, and I felt genuinely, unpleasantly bad, and I looked at his face for a while. And then I noticed the tea leaf. There was a tea leaf on his forehead, small, dark, right up near the hairline. Now, a man collapses in the street. 4 people carry him. He gets wiped down and laid out by the mortuary staff, who are professionals, who I had watched work for 8 months. And there's a tea leaf on his forehead. "You've got something on your," I said, and I reached over and I flicked it off, and the flick landed exactly where my fingertips needed to land, because I had been reaching for people's heads for 8 months, and I no longer had to think about it any more than you think about a doorknob. Fire dragon flame bullet, from a corpse. From a corpse that had a live man's memories in it, right up to and including the last 20 minutes, which involved lying down on a slab in a cold room and slowing his own heart with a Yamanaka technique I did not know existed in order to see who came to look at him. He was baiting me. 60-year-old dying man fakes his own death to find out whether the sick 14-year-old is what he thinks he is, and the sick 14-year-old walks in, feels sorry for him, and then robs his brain over a tea leaf. I did not change my face. I stood there for a respectful moment with my hands at my sides, and I said, out loud, to nobody, "Sorry, sir," and I turned around and walked out of that room at a completely normal speed. And what was in his head was so much worse than a laboratory. 20 years ago, a group of men in this village decided that the third Hokage should not be the third Hokage. Not a coup, nothing so quick. 20 years of the other thing, the patient thing. They were old-era men, the ones who'd been full-grown when the village was founded and had watched it get handed to a boy, and they had spent 2 decades quietly making sure that every bad thing that happened in Konoha had Hiruzen's fingerprints somewhere near it. The head of it was a man called Genshin, Nara, and I want you to understand that this man had been running it since before I was born, and had never once been suspected of anything, and was regarded around the village as a pleasant, retired administrator with a garden. And the missing people were the opportunity of his career, because he'd worked out what I'd worked out, which is that the disappearances went back to Kageyama, and Kageyama was Hiruzen's oldest friend and Hiruzen's shield, and the thing Hiruzen would protect before he protected himself. So the plan was simple, and it was beautiful. Make the village look at the missing people. Keep making the village look. Force Hiruzen to choose between giving up Kageyama and covering for him. He would cover for him. Genshin had known him 50 years, he was certain, and then the village would see the third Hokage stand in front of a man who takes civilians off the street, and it would be over. Not a coup, a resignation. And Daichi was the one who was going to hand the village the proof. Except a 60-year-old dying man cannot walk into the Hokage's office alone with a story about the Hokage's best friend and expect to leave the building. He needed a second voice, someone from outside the plot, someone young and harmless and unimpeachable, and in possession of a clan technique that lets him testify to what he saw in a dead man's head. I stood in a corridor under a prison and understood, with total clarity, that I had been cast. I was not being recruited, I was being loaded. And here's the part that made me go cold, because I'd had 8 months of practice at thinking 3 steps past where I wanted to. If Daichi walks into that office with me, one of 2 things happens. Either the Hokage protects Kageyama and Daichi wins, and the village tears itself in half. Or the Hokage doesn't, and Kageyama finds out that an interrogation division reader put him in front of the Hokage. And then there is a sick 14-year-old with an unfortunate accident on his file. There is no version of it where I am alive in a year. I went and found Kenshin and I asked for leave. Leave? He said. Yes, sir. You've been here 9 months. I'd like some time off. How much? Months, I said. 3, ideally. Kenshin took the sunglasses off and put them on the desk, which I had seen him do twice, and both times it had meant something. Shinji, are you in trouble? No, sir. Because if somebody in this building has. Nobody's touched me, I said, and I put a bit of a wobble in it, and I watched him decide to believe me for the wrong reason. He gave me a week. That's what a captain can give. A week. Unpaid. And he wasn't happy about it, and he made it conditional, because Kenshin has never in his life given a thing away clean. The condition was one more read. A Kumo barrier specialist they'd taken alive at the border, a man named Kalen, who'd been sitting in a cell for 11 days refusing to give up his squad. I put my hand on Kalen's head. Ding! Shadow clone technique. I want to slow down here because everybody in this story who is going to die from this point on dies because of what happened in that cell. A shadow clone is not a decoy. Every single one is a whole person. It has a fraction of my chakra and all of my mind, and it can walk and fight and lie and hold a conversation. And when it pops, everything it saw goes into my head like a letter, which means I can be in 2 places, which means I can be in 10, which means the single hardest problem in my entire life, that I am one boy with one body and a schedule that people check, evaporates. And it means I can train, because Sage Body doesn't spend anything, and a clone doesn't spend anything either. And if I put 100 clones in a room for a night and pop them in the morning, I wake up having done 100 nights of work. I gave Kenshin the location of 3 more Kumo ninja and the name of the man in the merchant quarter who was feeding them, and I did it with my eyes half shut and my hands shaking, and Kenshin put his hand on my shoulder to say, well done. So I had a seizure. Full theater. I went down sideways off the stool and did about 8 seconds of it on the stone floor, while a professional interrogator with 30 years of experience knelt over me shouting my name, and I would like it on the record that no part of me enjoyed that, except the parts that enjoyed it enormously. They carried me to the infirmary, and the Unbu who carried me had his arm under my shoulders and his head about 9 inches from my hand. Ding! Breakthrough technique, and a nice fat piece of administrative information, which was that a captain can grant a week, but leave of more than a month in wartime posture requires the signature of the Hokage. Which meant I needed somebody who could get in front of the Hokage, which meant I needed my friend. I spent 7 nights at Ichiraku waiting for Haruto. 7. I sat on the end stool from opening to close, ordering 1 bowl and making it last 2 hours, And every night, Hiroshi would put it in front of me, and every night I would let it go cold and clumpy while I watched the street through the gap in the curtain. By the fourth night, Hiroshi had stopped being polite about it. That's the fourth bowl you've killed. I'm eating it. You are not eating it. You're conducting a vigil over it. He took it away and slammed a fresh one down. Noodles have a window, boy. 4 minutes. After 4 minutes, you're eating string. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be quick. He gave me an extra egg. He'd been giving me an extra egg every night since the first one, and had never once mentioned it, and I had never once mentioned it either. And that's how that particular contract worked for the entire time I knew him. On the 7th night, Haruto came in. He was in field gear, and he'd been out for a fortnight, and he looked like it. And he sat down next to me and said, "Shinji, have you been here the whole time?" "No." "He has," said Hiroshi. "Thanks, Hiroshi." So I told him, not the truth, a version. I told him I'd got tangled up in something at work above my level, that a senior officer had wanted me to be part of something, that the senior officer was now dead, and that I needed to be out of that building for a few months, and my captain could only give me a week. Every word of that was true. That's the trick. You never have to lie if you're willing to be extremely selective. And Haruto listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which almost nobody does. And then he said, "Why didn't you come and find me? It's not your problem. You waited on a stool for 7 days. That's different. That is not different, Shinji. That is the same thing, but sadder." He got up. He was already going. And at the flap, he stopped and turned around and said the thing that ended up being the actual load-bearing beam under this entire episode. "I'll get it signed." You can't just, "I'll get it signed." And he did. It took him 9 days, and I still don't know entirely what he traded for it. And when the paper came through, it wasn't 3 months. It was open-ended. Leave until the war starts, on the Hokage's own mark, for a Interrogation Division reader with an Academy record that said, "Unremarkable." Kenshin put it on my desk and looked at me for a while. "Asano Haruto went to the Hokage for you." "Yes, sir." "Why would he do that?" And I honestly did not have an answer, and I still don't, and I've had a lot of time to think about it. Kenshin picked up his sunglasses and put them back on. "You are a true Anbu ninja," he said, "and I have no idea how you are also this." Then he told me to get out of his office and not to die in a ditch. Before I could actually take the leave, they gave me one last customer, and he turned out to be the best afternoon I had all year. He'd been picked up at Konoha Hospital, a man in a hospital coat going through cabinets at 3 in the morning, caught by a nurse, taken in on burglary. The paperwork said opportunist thief. I put my hand on his head before he'd finished sitting down, and the paperwork was wrong. He was a Suna Chunin. He'd been in Konoha 2 years. He was not stealing anything. He was making a list. Specifically, a list of which antidotes Konoha Hospital stocks and in what quantity, because if you know what a village can cure, you know exactly which poison to use. And the woman who wanted that list was an old lady in Suna named Shiori, who had been building the most frightening poisons in the world for about 40 years. 2 years of work, nearly finished. Now, the correct move here is to report it. Up the chain, out of my hands, somebody senior takes it. Done. Except I was 3 days from open-ended leave that Haruto had bought me with a favor he wouldn't explain, and I had spent 9 months building a reputation as a boy who fumbles, and if I cracked a 2-year deep Suna asset on site, then every single thing I'd built came apart. So I decided to be terrible at my job, on purpose, in front of a witness. You have to understand the room I'm working with. There's a chain on the wall, there's a brazier, there's a rack with about 15 implements on it, and the implements are, I want to stress, real, and they'd all been used, and not by me. I stood up and I said, in the voice of a boy trying to sound like his boss, "Right, so." And then I picked up the wrong thing. I picked up a pair of long-handled pliers, the kind you take fingernails with, and I held them upside down. Then I noticed they were upside down. Then I turned them over and dropped them. "Sorry," I said. I picked them up. "Sorry, first one of these." The Suna Chunin, who had spent 2 years being nobody at a hospital and had trained for exactly this room, said nothing, because a trained man says nothing. "So the chain goes." I looked at the chain. "The chain goes on you, right? Obviously. Do I do the wrists, or—" I looked at him. "Sorry, do you know how this goes? Have you—" "I have never been arrested in my life." "Right, no, course." I got the chain on him. It took me 4 minutes, and I got it wrong twice, and at one point I chained his left wrist to his own belt, and he had to point that out. Then I went and got the branding iron and put it in the brazier, and then I stood there watching it, and then I said, "How long does this take?" "I don't know." "Do you think it's ready?" "How would I know?" You're closer to it. And I want you to understand what is happening inside that man's head while this is going on, because I could see it happening, because my hand had been on his skull 90 seconds earlier, and I knew exactly how his mind was shaped. A trained agent walks into an interrogation with a wall built. The wall is made of everything he expects. He expects competence. He expects cruelty. He expects a professional, and he has rehearsed being alone in a room with a professional 1,000 times. There is nothing in the training for a 14-year-old in a cat mask who cannot work the pliers. Because if you are being hurt by an expert, the hurting has a shape, it has a purpose and a limit, and a man on the other end of it who wants something and will stop when he gets it. If you are being hurt by an idiot, there is no floor. He might kill you by accident. He might set you on fire trying to make a point. He might get the pliers stuck. I picked the iron up out of the brazier. It wasn't glowing. I'd put it in the cold end. I said, and turned it over. And then, and this is the bit I'm proudest of, I touched it with my actual finger to see if it was hot. It wasn't. But he didn't know that. He watched a child in a cat mask press his bare fingertip to a branding iron and then say, "Yeah, that's fine," in a completely level voice. That's when the wall went. He came off that post like something out of a trap. He'd got one wrist free 4 minutes earlier, and he'd been sitting on it, waiting for the real interrogator to arrive. And instead, the 14-year-old had started casually touching heated metal, and something in him said, "This is a lunatic, and I am going to die of nonsense." He went straight for the door, and I went straight to the floor. I threw myself into the wall, knocked the brazier over, took a long scrape down my forearm on the corner of the stone bench, and lay there on my back, yelling for the guards in the voice of a boy who has just been thrown across a room. They caught him in the corridor. He hadn't got 12 steps. A Sunachunin 2 years deep, blown by his own legs because he'd been sitting perfectly still and prepared for cruelty, and the one thing he could not sit still through was incompetence. Kenshin came down. He looked at the wreckage, and at the brazier, and at the coals across the floor, and at me on my back with my arm open, and I sat up and said the sentence I'd built the entire performance to be able to say. "Captain, I'm so sorry. He got out because of me. But before he ran, he said something about a woman in Suna, and antidotes, and I don't know what it means, but I think I heard you say that name once. Watch what that does. The credit does not go to me. The credit goes to the man in the room who recognized the significance of a name a frightened child half heard. Kenshin walks out of my failure with a 2-year Suna operation on his file. I walk out of it with a cut arm and a reputation for panicking. He had them medic my arm. He put me on report for the chain, which I deserved, and then he pushed my leave through personally that same day, 2 days early, because in his professional judgment the boy needed to be out of that building before something worse happened. I sat on the wall outside with my arm bandaged and 48 straight days of unsupervised time in my pocket, and I have honestly never felt cleverer, and I want to be clear that I was about to spend all of it on a plan that nearly got me killed twice. While all that was going on, a body came up out of the river, male, 30s, been in the water 4 or 5 days. They laid him out on the bank, and the security division came down, and the man who identified him was a young Uchiha who'd been on the roster maybe 2 years. Shusuke. He was maybe 20 then. Serious. Not the man he became, not yet, but you could see the shape of him. He looked at that body for about 10 seconds and said a name, and the name was Ryota, and Ryota was on the missing persons list. I need to explain why one identification broke this village open, because it took me 3 days to see it and about a minute to see all of it once I did. 16 people had gone missing over a year, and it had stayed filed as runaways because there were no bodies. No body, no crime. That's it. That's the whole reason it had been survivable. The instant a name goes on a corpse, the runaway file is dead. It becomes a murder file, and murder files go to the Konoha military police, and the Konoha military police are the Uchiha. So Hiruzen was now going to have to sit in a room and be asked about the missing people by the Uchiha in an official capacity, with a record being kept. And I found out later, out of a head I should not have had access to, what happened in that room. Hiruzen asked Kageyama directly, and Kageyama did not deny it. He confirmed there had been research, that it had been necessary, that it had been sanctioned in principle years earlier, and that he had assumed Hiruzen understood what sanctioned in principle meant. And Hiruzen, who is not a stupid man, who is in fact one of the cleverest men alive, went out into his village and publicly, on the record, said there was no evidence of any such thing. He covered. He covered because the alternative was tearing his own administration open in front of a clan that was already looking for a reason. And in a house on the west side, an old retired administrator with a garden read the transcript of that statement and understood that he had just won. Because Genshin hadn't known. That's the part that gets me. He'd been pushing on the missing persons for a year on instinct, because it was the softest place in Hiruzen's armor. He didn't have proof of anything. Hiruzen covering for Kageyama was the proof. And here's the truly foul bit, the bit I only got out of Daichi's head, which is that Ryota did not die in a laboratory. Genshin's people killed Ryota. They took a man who was already on the missing list, killed him, and put him in the river where he would surface in a week, specifically so the file would flip from runaways to murder and land on the Uchiha's desk. They murdered a civilian to force a paperwork change. That's who I was up against. Not monsters, administrators. Meanwhile, I was on holiday. 48 days. First morning, I did what any sensible person would do, which is I went and sat in a tea house and listened to old men talk. You would not believe what people say out loud in a tea house. I got the entire political weather of Konoha in about 4 hours. Who was frightened of the Uchiha? Who thought the Hokage had gone soft? Which stall was overcharging? Whose son had come back from the border wrong? And on the way home, I walked past a man on the corner and, without deciding to, I reached up and patted him on the back of the head and said, "Hey!" The switch went in the back of my skull. He turned around. Big guy, carpenter, arms like fence posts. "Sorry," I said. "Sorry, thought you were Haruto." He looked down at a 14-year-old with a bandaged arm. "Do I look like Haruto?" "From the back, you really do." He laughed. He actually laughed and clapped me on the shoulder and went on his way. And I stood there on the corner with a stranger's entire life in my head and a small bump of chakra and thought, oh no, this works. I did it 400 times over the next 6 weeks. I am not exaggerating for effect. I kept a tally for the first fortnight and then stopped because it stopped being useful. 400 people, minimum, on corners, in queues, coming out of the bathhouse, at the fish market on a busy morning where I could get 3 in a minute if I was willing to keep moving. "Hi, Haruto." Pat. "Oh, well sorry, wrong guy." And here is the discovery that reorganized my entire understanding of my own ability. And I want to give it to you exactly the way it arrived because it felt like being hit. Ordinary citizens are better than prisoners. Not for techniques. A carpenter has no techniques. For everything else. Because a prisoner gives me one man's life, mostly spent in one room, ending badly. A fish seller on the corner gives me 30 years of watching the same street, every face that ever walked down it, every night somebody came home late, every argument, every debt, every visitor to every house on that road since before I was born. 400 of them, laid over each other, is a map of Konoha that no intelligence service on Earth possesses. Not the Hokage, not Kageyama, and Kageyama has agents in every district. Because an agent files a report about what he thought was important, I got the raw feed. I got the parts nobody bothered to report. The interrogation division was a good farm. The village was better. And it was free. And it was invisible. And every single person I did it to walked away thinking about a slightly odd, polite boy who thought they were somebody else. Until the 14th of the month, at about 4 in the afternoon, on the main street, when it all came down at once. I'd got sloppy. 6 weeks of no consequences will do that. I'd worked the same 3 streets 4 days running because they were busy, which is exactly the mistake I'd have flagged in anybody else. I patted a man's head. "Hi, Haruto." "Sorry, wrong guy." 40 steps on, patted another one. "Hi, Haruto." "Sorry." And a small boy, maybe 7, who had been eating something on a step and watching me do this for approximately 20 minutes, stood up and shouted, at full volume, in the middle of the busiest street in Konoha, "Minato! He's looking for you!" And Haruto, who lived 4 streets away, who was off duty, who was in fact at that exact moment buying vegetables 1 block over, came around the corner at a jog. "Shinji, what's wrong?" I would like to describe the next 4 seconds. The street went quiet in a wave, the way water goes flat, and I watched, in slow motion, as roughly a dozen men who I had personally patted on the head over the past 6 weeks, several of them that very afternoon, all turned to look at the actual Asano Haruto, and then all turned to look at me and did the arithmetic. There is a specific silence that happens when a lot of people work out the same thing at the same time. I recommend never being in the middle of it. Somebody said, "He does not look like Haruto." Somebody else said, "You did that to me on Tuesday." Somebody else said, "You did that to me twice." Haruto stood there holding a bag of vegetables, looking from face to face with an expression of total and increasing confusion, and I want you to know that I have faced a Jonin assassin in a dark forest since then, and it was less stressful than this. So I did the only thing available. I straightened up, I dropped my voice, and I said, I can't discuss it. Silence. I'm attached to the interrogation division, I said. I've been assigned to identify individuals in this village who are not who they say they are. The method is classified. I'd ask all of you not to repeat what you've seen, and I'd ask you not to be offended, because if you're standing here confused, it means you passed. Absolute silence. And then the carpenter, the very first one, my patient zero, said, So we're all cleared? You're all cleared. And the street cheered. They cheered. 12 grown men who had been patted on the head by a teenager applauded themselves for passing a test that did not exist, and one of them bought me a drink, and another one asked if I could check his brother-in-law. Haruto walked me home. He didn't say anything for about 2 streets. Then he said, There's no such assignment, is there? No. Are you going to tell me what it actually is? No. He nodded. He thought about it for about half a street, and then he said, Okay. That's it. Okay. A man finds out his friend has been lying to a crowd of 30 people, asks him twice, gets refused twice, and says okay, and changes the subject to whether he should be worried that May has started being suspiciously nice to him. I have thought about that a lot since, and I have concluded that it was not stupidity, and it was not even trust exactly. I think Haruto had simply decided a long time ago what kind of person he was going to be, and had noticed that the kind of person he was going to be does not interrogate his friends in the street. He never asked again. Not once, in everything that came afterwards, and there was a lot of afterwards. We ended up at Ichiraku, obviously. Everything ends up at Ichiraku. May was already there and had already ordered, and she looked at the two of us coming in and said, Why do you both look like that? Like what? Like you've done something. He's fine, said Haruto. I didn't ask if he was fine, I said he looks like he's done something. She pointed a chopstick at me. You've got a face like a cat coming out of a shed. And I sat down between the two of them and let them argue about my face for a while. And I want to describe what was actually going on inside my head during that conversation, because it is the exact thing that this whole year comes down to. I was working out the causal chain. Shusuke identifies a body from the river. Because of that, the file goes from runaways to murder. Because of that, the case goes to the Konoha Military Police, which is the Uchiha. Because of that, the Uchiha are now formally, on paper, investigating the disappearance of civilians. Because of that, they will eventually walk into a room and ask the Hokage a question he cannot answer. Because of that, the Hokage will cover for Kageyama. Because of that, the Uchiha will learn that the leadership of this village will lie to their faces. And I can see it running forwards from there like water finding a slope. Not next month, not next year, but the grievance goes in the ground now, and it is watered every single day by ordinary administrative decisions taken by decent people, and about 15 years from now, there is a night with nothing left of that clan but 2 brothers. I could see the whole thing, sitting on a stool between my only friend and his terrifying girlfriend, eating noodles, and here's what I decided. Nothing. I decided to do nothing about it. Because the only way to stop that particular avalanche is to stand in front of it in public, and the person who stands in front of it in public gets buried first. And I had a very strict rule about not being interesting. I want to be honest that I did not agonize. I would love to tell you I lay awake. I ate my noodles. You've gone quiet, said May. He's always quiet. He's differently quiet. This is a plotting quiet. He's 14. That is exactly the age they start plotting, said May, with total certainty, and she was correct, and I have never met anybody else in my entire life who clocked me that fast and then simply moved on to complaining about the price of eggs. Then the bill came, and I discovered that I had spent every coin I owned on 6 weeks of tea houses and market stalls, and that I had just cheerfully announced I was buying. I patted all 4 pockets, twice, in front of both of them. Oh no, said May, delighted. I've got money. You have not got money. I have a plan about money. Hiroshi watched the whole performance without expression, then took a scrap of paper, wrote something on it, and stuck it on a nail behind the counter. You're on the wall, he said. What's the wall? The wall is where I write down what people owe me. There are 6 people on the wall. He went back to the pot. 2 of them are dead. That's not encouraging. It's not meant to be encouraging. Eat your noodles inside 4 minutes. I ate them in 4 minutes, and I did not enjoy them. Because I was doing sums. The sums were about a floorboard, because I was 3 days away from coming into a very large amount of money that had belonged to a man nobody could ever know I had killed. And money you cannot explain is not money. It's evidence with a number on it. What I needed was a cash business. High volume, small amounts, no receipts, run by somebody who liked me and asked nothing. And I was sitting in one. But that comes later. Because 2 days after that, the Interrogation Division called every reader in, off leave, no exceptions. A third body had surfaced, man called Kihito. And the Konoha military police had formally requested that the second one, a man called Daisuke, have his memory read in the presence of a police witness. Which was a problem, because I already knew what was in Daisuke's head. I knew because I'd had my hand on Daichi's forehead over a tea leaf, and inside Daichi's memories was the afternoon Daichi had gone down into the corpse room alone with the authority of a perception team leader and edited the memory of a dead man. Not fabricated, edited. Trimmed the last 4 minutes and pushed one image up to the front so it would be the first thing a reader hit. The image was a masked man in a dark green robe with his face bandaged. The Uchiha were going to walk into that room and ask my division to read a corpse, and my division was going to hand them, in an official session, with a police witness watching, a dead man's dying testimony that Kageyama did it. And it would be a lie. And it would work. I went to the session. I was on leave, so I had no business being there, and I went anyway, and I stood at the back with my arms folded like a boy who has come in to see what all the fuss is about. 2 perception team seniors did the reading. A police captain from the Uchiha stood at the head of the slab with his arms crossed and did not blink for 11 minutes. Kenshin stood by the door with his sunglasses on in a room with one lamp. And I watched a man I had worked under for 9 months lay his hands on Daisuke's temples. And I watched his shoulders go up about half an inch, and I knew from that half inch exactly what he'd just found, because I had already seen it from the other side. He said, "There's an image." "Describe it," said the Uchiha. "A man, dark robe, face bandaged, right side. That's the last thing in him." And the room did not react at all, which is how you know a room has just gone off like a bomb. Here's my situation. I know it's a forgery. I am the only living person who can prove it's a forgery, and the proof is that I robbed a fake corpse's brain in this exact room and saw the man do the editing. If I open my mouth, I have to explain how I know. And the explanation is a technique I have hidden from my clan, my captain, and the Hokage for 9 months, used on a senior officer's head without consent, on a slab, in a mortuary. So I stood at the back of the room with my arms folded and let a lie go into the record. I have made peace with a lot of what I did that year. That one still gets me at about 4 in the morning sometimes, because it worked exactly as designed. That single image is what turned the Uchiha from a police force with a question into a clan with a target, and the shape of everything that happened to that clan for the next 15 years was in that room in 11 minutes, and I could have stopped it with 1 sentence and did not. You can decide what you like about that. I've had longer to think about it than you have, and I still come out the same place, which is that I'd do it again, and that this is probably the worst thing about me. Anyway, I went home and put 3,000 shadow clones in a wood. I want to talk about what that actually looks like, because when people hear shadow clone training, they picture a man punching a tree. Picture a clearing at 1 in the morning with about 100 of me in it, and every single one is working. 20 are doing chakra control on a leaf. 20 are running the fire seals over and over until the seals are the same thing as breathing. 10 are hitting a rock with a stick, badly, learning why it's badly. 10 are lying on their backs doing nothing, which is a lie, because they're going through 400 civilians' memories and cross-indexing them. And in the morning, they all pop, and it comes back like a wave breaking on the inside of my skull, and I sit down for 10 minutes, and then I get up having lived 4 days. 3 days of that. That's all I gave it. 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, I could take an ordinary Konoha genin apart without moving my feet. I'm not saying that to boast. I'm saying it because it's the exact reason I couldn't go back to work. There is no version of me that walks into a building full of professional observers 3 days after that and is still believable as the boy who falls over jogging. So I went back to the streets, because streets don't measure anything. Only I'd burnt Naruto, obviously. There were about 40 men in Konoha who now believed Naruto was some sort of counterintelligence code word, and I could not walk up behind a stranger and say that name in that district again. So I changed the name. Hi, Shusuke, which, in hindsight, was insane, because there is exactly one Shusuke in that village, and he is a serving officer in the police force that everybody is currently frightened of. But it worked better than Naruto had. Because when you pat a stranger on the head and say a police officer's name and then go, "Oh, sorry, wrong person," that man does not want to talk to you. That man wants to be somewhere else. Nobody investigates a boy who seems to have mistaken them for a policeman. They just walk faster. I did about 90 of those in 2 days, and then on the third day, at a fruit stall, in daylight, I said, "Hi, Shusuke," and patted a man on the back of the head, and he turned around. 22, maybe. Police jacket with the crest on the back. And his eyes were red with 3 commas turning in them before he'd even fully come round, because he was a trained Uchiha and something had touched his skull. Ding! Great fire dragon technique. I had just patted an active-duty Konoha military police officer on the head in a market, and he was looking directly at me with a fully awakened Sharingan. His name was Kai. He was Shusuke's friend, and I'm going to be honest with you, that matters later in a way I did not enjoy at all. What did you just do? I thought you were Shusuke. You don't put your hand on. He stopped. He looked at me properly. 14. Skinny. Bandage still on my arm. And I watched the threat assessment in his head go from contact from behind, unknown, to child. And I watched him hate that he'd flared his eyes in a market over it. Why would you think I was Shusuke? And this is where I made the decision that ended up in 3 separate people's memories and eventually saved my life. So pay attention, because it's stupid. Because I'm his biggest fan, I said. Kai blinked. You're his what? I'm his biggest fan. He identified the body from the river. Everyone's talking about it. I want to join the security division when I'm older. I've been I did an embarrassed thing with my shoulders. I've been looking for him. Now, was that a good lie? It was a magnificent lie. Because it explains the pat, it explains the name, it makes me pathetic instead of suspicious, and it gives a young officer in a clan that has spent 20 years being resented by this village the experience of a child telling him that people admire what he does. Kai bought me a peach. He bought me a peach, and he talked to me for a quarter of an hour, and he told me some things about the case that he absolutely should not have told a member of the public. And I stood there eating a stranger's fruit with his entire life already sitting in my head. And in that life was the third body, Kihito. And the fact that Shusuke had gone into a meeting that morning and pushed hard in front of everybody for a door-to-door search of every house in the village. Every house. Including the ones with clan gates on them. He meant it well. That's the thing about Shusuke that I never quite got past. He always meant it well. He thought if you looked in every house you'd find the answer and it would stop, and he could not see that what actually happens when the Uchiha knock on 4,000 doors is that 4,000 families spend the rest of their lives remembering the day the Uchiha came into their house. Genshin didn't have to do anything. He'd lit the fuse a year earlier, and then just kept out of the way while decent men carried it around the village for him. It took me 7 days to find the informant. 7 days lying in the dark with 400 lives in my head, cross-referencing. That's what the clones were really for. It's the least dramatic thing in this entire story, and it's the thing that actually won it. Here's what I was looking for. Somebody who kept showing up, because a conspiracy that has run 20 years without being caught does not use ninja on the street. Ninja get noticed. It uses somebody who has a reason to be everywhere, and somewhere in 400 ordinary Konoha memories, the same face was going to appear more often than chance allows. He appeared 11 times, a man in his 30s with a limp. At the fish market on the morning of the second body, outside the police post the afternoon the police got the case. In the tea house on the east side the evening 4 men had a very loud argument about the Hokage. 3 separate people remembered that argument. All 3 of them remembered it starting at the next table. His name was Ah Wu. And when I dug him out properly, I nearly laughed out loud, because Ah Wu was Ryota's brother. Ryota, the first body out of the river. The man the Cabal murdered to flip the file. They killed his brother, and then they used him, and I would put money on the fact that he never knew, because I read him 3 days later, and he genuinely did not. The candied hawthorn stall was on a corner near the west gate, and Ah Wu bought from it every second day. I'd been watching him for 4 days. I could have taken him at any point. I could have put a clone in front of him and had this done in a minute. But a man in a 20-year-old conspiracy who gets touched by a stranger is a man who reports being touched by a stranger. It had to be nothing. It had to be so completely nothing that he didn't have a sentence to describe it in. So I bought a stick of candied hawthorn, and I stood about 8 feet behind him in the queue, and I waited until he'd paid and turned, and then I got a cramp. A really good one. Calf. The kind that folds you sideways with no warning. I went down into him. Not hard, just enough that a grown man instinctively catches a falling child, which they do, every time, all of them. It's the most reliable thing in human beings. He got an arm round me, and I got a hand on the back of his head on the way down and made a noise like an animal. And 20 years of a conspiracy went into my head on a street corner over a stick of candied fruit. All right, easy. Cramp, I gasped. Sit down, sit on the step. Have you eaten today? He sat me on the step. He was nice about it. He asked if I wanted him to fetch somebody. He gave me his water. This man had spent 11 months feeding a plot that got his own brother killed, and he was crouched on a curb making sure a stranger's kid could breathe. I want to hold both those things at once because that's what that year was. I said I was fine and thanked him and limped off around the corner, and then I stopped limping and I stood against a wall and went through it all. And it was worse than I thought. Because the plan had a step 6. Steps 1 through 5 I already had from Daichi. Force the file open, kill Ryota to flip it, get the Uchiha involved, make Hiruzen cover for Kageyama, set the clans against each other. Step 6 was the one Daichi hadn't been told, because Daichi was a perception team leader who had a conscience and had started asking about it. Step 6 was that when the whole thing came apart, somebody had to be holding it. And the somebody was going to be a Yamanaka from the Interrogation division. Because a Yamanaka can plant a memory. So a Yamanaka is who you blame for a planted memory. Because the Interrogation division touches every corpse in this village. Because the Interrogation division is already the department nobody likes. Daichi had been the designated hand. And Daichi had been getting difficult. And Daichi had a 14-year-old subordinate who nobody would miss, and who could be drugged, edited, and floated in the river with a very convincing confession sitting in his head. I was the fallback. I have been in a couple of genuinely dangerous situations since then, and I have never had the reaction I had leaning on that wall, which is that my hands went completely steady. Not calm, the opposite of calm. The thing where everything gets very quiet and very simple, and you stop having feelings about it because feelings are not load-bearing right now. I spent 5 days working out what to do, and at the end of the 5 days, I noticed something that made me laugh in an empty room. I was clear. Genuinely, provably clear. Because for the entire period in which this blew up, from Ryota surfacing to the reading of Daisuke, I had been on open-ended leave. Signed in the Hokage's own hand, at the request of Asano Haruto, for medical reasons. With a captain's report in my file describing a boy who collapses on a jog and has a seizure when somebody pats his shoulder. Every single person in the Interrogation division was now a suspect. Every single officer in the police was compromised by proximity. And I was the one person in this entire village who had a Hokage-signed alibi for the whole thing, obtained a month before it started, for reasons that had nothing to do with it. I had jumped off the first floor to get away from a fire and landed on the roof. I had 5 days spare, so I went and watched some Maniacs, the training ground on the east side, before dawn, and there were 2 people in it, a man in his 30s with the most aggressive haircut I have ever seen, and a small boy of about 6 who was an exact copy of him at 40% scale. Kensei Akira and Kenta. The man was doing a handstand, on one hand. The boy was next to him, on 2 hands, shaking like a leaf and falling over roughly every 11 seconds and getting straight back up. They had been there, I later established, since about 3 in the morning. A group of genin came through around 6 and made a lot of noise about it. Eternal genin. The eternal genin and his kid, one of them did an impression. They were 19, maybe 20, and they thought it was the funniest thing in the world, and Akira heard every word of it and did not stop his handstand and did not stop counting for his son. I sat on the fence for 4 mornings and copied everything he did. Not the strength. I had strength. The other thing. Because there's a way of moving that comes from having done one motion 200,000 times, and no amount of chakra gives you that, and no shadow clone gives it to you either, because the clone doesn't have your actual joints. I never spoke to him. I'd have liked to. But every conversation I have with a person is a thread somebody can pull, and Akira is exactly the sort of man who'd have remembered me forever. On the fifth morning, Daichi was standing at the edge of the trees. He looked like a corpse that had come to a decision, and I thought, well, there it is. You're not sick, he said. I'm extremely sick. I've watched you for an hour. Then you've watched a sick boy for an hour. He came closer. Walk with me. And I said, all right. And then I did the single most important thing I did all year. I chose the route. I walked ahead of him. Not fast, just always half a step in front, always taking the turn first, the way a boy does when he's nervous and moving. And every turn I took went away from the village. He talked the whole time about the missing people, about how the village was going to tear itself apart, about how a man in a position like his has a duty and how a man in a position like mine has one too. It was a good speech. I've thought since that he'd probably been writing it for weeks. We were 35 minutes into the woods before he noticed where he was. He stopped. He looked around at the trees, and I watched a 40-year interrogator do the arithmetic and get it right for the first and last time in our relationship. You brought me out here. You said walk with me. You picked every turn. I did. The birds were extremely loud. I remember that. It was a lovely morning. What is it you want, sir? And he told me. He told me the whole thing, straight out, in the open, because he decided I was going to say yes, and because part of him, the 40 years part, wanted somebody to know before he died. He needed a witness with a clan technique to stand in front of the Hokage. He'd tried to recruit me 4 times. I'd said no 4 times, so he'd stopped asking. The plan was a sedative in a cup, 6 hours of work on my head while I was under, and a memory of a confession I never gave, sitting in me like a stone in a fish. And then a 14-year-old body in the river with the 4th name from the missing list, and a reader would go into it and find Kageyama, and Hiruzen would have to answer for a dead child in his own village. You'd have to kill me, I said. Yes, you've thought about that, every night for a month. And there are 16 of them, he said, and 1 of you. I said it back to him. That's what I did. I stood in that clearing and recited his own plan back to him in order. In detail, including the 2 parts he hadn't said out loud, including the name of the sedative, including the fact that it had to go in a drink and not in food because of the onset window. And I watched a 60-year-old man's face come apart in real time, because there are only 2 ways a 14-year-old knows that. Either he's been in the conspiracy the whole time, or he has been in Daichi's head, and the second one is impossible. Daichi had been running Yamanaka techniques for 40 years. Nobody gets into that head. Nobody has ever got into that head. How? He said. You had a tea leaf on your forehead. He went for me. He was fast. 60 and dying, and he was still fast. And he had a hand out for my temple, and the technique he was reaching for would have put me on the ground in a second if it had landed. I caught his wrist. And I want to describe this properly, because this is the first time in this entire story that I stopped acting. I did not dodge. I did not do anything clever. I reached up and caught a Jonin's wrist out of the air with one hand, and then I closed my fingers, and every small bone in it went at once, like standing on a bag of dry sticks. He made a sound I hadn't heard a person make. Sir, I said, you did this. I said no 4 times. I kicked him in the chest. He went into a tree. And then I did the fire, because he was still trying to make seals with a hand that was mostly gravel, and because there was no version of this where he walked out of that clearing and I lived. Great fireball. The one I got off Kenshin's forehead by accident while explaining something about a salt cart. It was very quick. I'll leave it there. He didn't say anything at the end, and I didn't either, and I don't think either of us had anything left to say. Then the wood caught. Because it was summer and dry, and I just put an A-rank fire technique into a stand of trees 11 minutes walk from a residential district. So I spent the next 40 minutes putting out a forest fire. I want that in the record. I had just killed a man, and I stood there in a burning wood with a water technique I'd taken off a Kumo prisoner, beating out a fire I'd started, sweating, furious, because the alternative was 200 houses. It took 40 minutes. I got a burn across my shoulder that I had to explain later as a cooking accident. And at the end of it, I stood in a black clearing with a dead senior officer at my feet and thought, this is genuinely the worst possible way this could have gone. Then I buried him. Not in one place. 13. 13 holes spread over about a mile, none of them deep, all of them under different kinds of ground. Because the entire village runs on bodies. A body is a witness that keeps testifying after death. It gets found, it gets identified, and then a Yamanaka puts a hand on its head, and everything I have done comes out in 11 minutes. 13 small holes, and no body anywhere. And while I was digging the last one, in the dark, I worked out what I was going to do about the other 16, because that was the situation. Daichi was gone, and Daichi was one man in a plot that had 16 more, and every single one of them knew there was a designated fallback in the interrogation division, and the fallback was me. I couldn't kill 16 people. I was 14, and I'd needed a forest fire to manage one. But I didn't have to. There was already a predator in this village who kills people for exactly this, who had, in fact, an entire department for it, who would very much like to know that a 20-year conspiracy had spent the last 11 months constructing a public case against him. I didn't need to eat the wolf. I needed to introduce the wolf to the tiger. I broke into a dead man's house that night, which is easier than breaking into a living man's house because nobody's expecting you and the neighbors don't check on a place that's supposed to be empty. Daichi had a narrow house on the east side with almost nothing in it. One good chair, a wall of scrolls, a shrine with a woman's picture on it, and the picture had been dusted recently, which I have decided not to think about. I took 3 things: a cloak, dark, with a hood, the kind couriers wear, a pair of gloves, and a floor tile in the bedroom that came up when you pushed the corner, under which was more money than I had ever seen in one place, in the untraceable form that men like Daichi keep money in. Then I sat at his desk until dawn and taught myself to be him. Forging handwriting is not drawing. Everybody gets that wrong. You are not copying a shape. You are copying a habit. It's the pressure at the start of a stroke. It's which letters he joins and which he lifts for. It's the fact that Daichi's brush always dragged a fraction at the end of a downstroke because of an old injury to his thumb, which I knew because I had his memory of getting the injury. That's the advantage nobody could ever compete with. I wasn't imitating his handwriting from a sample. I had the inside of his hand. 9 hours, 200 and some sheets. And by morning, I could write in Daichi's hand faster than I could write in my own. Then I did Kenshin's, which took another 4, because Kenshin writes like a man filling in a form under fire. And then I wrote 3 letters. I want to walk you through these because these 3 pieces of paper are the entire back half of this story, and each one of them is aimed at a completely different person's specific weakness. Letter 1 is from Daichi to a man called Akihito, who is in Root. Root is Kageyama's. It's the department that officially doesn't exist and unofficially does everything. And a Root operative does not open a letter from a stranger. He opens a letter that arrives correctly, which is why the letter needed a word. There was a code word for Root correspondence. I knew it because 9 months earlier I had been standing in an office with 2 fingers on my captain's forehead, and 30 years had come across, and in the middle of that 30 years was a completely unremarkable afternoon in which Kenshin had processed some interdepartmental traffic. The word was walnut. Letter 2 is from Kenshin to a police liaison called Masaru Riku. Different word, hazelnut. Letter 3 has no name on it at all, and we'll get to letter 3. I put the cloak on, and I put the hood up, and I went and delivered them by hand, as a courier, and I did it in daylight, because a courier who comes at night is a spy, and a courier who comes at 11 in the morning is a bloke doing his job. Akihito took his at a side door. He said, "From?" "Walnut," I said. And a Root operative who has been trained since childhood to trust nothing on earth relaxed by a measurable amount, because the box had been ticked. That's all trust is in an organization. It's a box. I handed the letter up, and my hand went over the top of his head on the follow-through, and he was so busy checking the seal on the paper that he didn't register it, and I got a Root operative's entire career for the price of a word. Same at the police post. Hazelnut. Same pat. 2 men. 2 lives. 11 minutes of work. And then I went home and waited for the letters to be read, and I want you to understand exactly what those letters said, because this is the only fight I have ever won, and I won it with a brush. The letter to Kageyama via Akihito was from a frightened senior interrogation division officer who had discovered something and did not know who else to tell. It said that a group of old-era men had been running an operation against the Hokage's office for 2 decades. It said the disappearances were being used as the lever. It said Ryota had been murdered by the plotters themselves, specifically to flip the file to the Uchiha. Every word of that was true. That's what made it lethal. And then it gave the names. 16 names, all correct, plus 2. I added 2. I added Akihito, the root operative who took the letter. And I added Masaru Riku, the police liaison who took the other one. Now think about what that does, because if the letter has 16 real names on it, Kageyama confirms them, acts, and the matter closes, and I remain a 14-year-old with a secret. But if the letter contains the name of the man who delivered it and the name of a police officer, then the moment Kageyama acts on it, the conspiracy is no longer 16 retired men in gardens. It has a hand inside Root and a hand inside the police. And a man like Kageyama, presented with a hand inside his own department, does not investigate. He amputates. He killed Akihito in the room. I got this months later out of somebody else's head, and I have never been able to shake the detail, which is that Akihito was still holding the letter he'd carried. He read his own name on a list he was delivering, and then his employer of 11 years killed him for it, and Akihito had never done a single disloyal thing in his life. That one's mine. I don't dress it up. Then Kageyama handed the list to his right hand, a man from the Aburame called Kazuki, and told him to make it disappear, all of it, quietly, in order. Fuse 1, lit. The second letter, from Kenshin to Masaru Riku, said something much simpler. It said, I have reason to believe the disappearances are being conducted under Kageyama's authority, that the corpse evidence is being managed, and that if the police force does not act, it will be the police force that carries this. It was 1 page. It was in a captain's hand. It said out loud the thing every Uchiha in that building had privately believed for 11 months, and it said it in the handwriting of a man from another department, which is the only way a thing like that ever becomes real to people. Masaru Riku took it to his captain, a man named Jinbei, who ran the Konoha military police, and who had been looking for exactly this piece of paper his entire career. Fuse 2, lit. So now, Root is hunting the Cabal, and the police are hunting Root, and neither of them knows the other one has been aimed, and the man who aimed them is a 14-year-old on medical leave who spends his afternoons at a ramen stall. Which brings me to the ramen stall, and to the single best idea I had that year. I had a dead man's money. A serious amount of it, in a form nobody could trace, sitting under a floorboard in a house I could not go back to, belonging to a man who had officially collapsed of a heart condition and whose estate was going to be looked at by somebody eventually. Money you cannot explain is not money. It's evidence with a value. I needed a business, cash, high volume, low individual amounts, no records anybody could audit, run by somebody who liked me and asked nothing. I sat down on the end stool and said, Hiroshi, how many bowls do you sell in a day? Why? How many? 130, 160 on a good one. And how many of those are the same 40 people? He stopped wiping the counter. Most of them. So they come every week and they pay every time and you never see a single coin up front. That's how food works, boy. What if it wasn't? And I laid it out. A card. You pay for 30 bowls today at a discount, and you get a card with your name on it, and every time you come in, he ticks it. 10 cards on the wall become 100. The customer feels clever because he's saved money. Hiroshi gets a month of income in one morning and never has an empty Tuesday again. And there is now a shop in Konoha where large sums of cash arrive up front, from named individuals, for goods delivered later, with no receipt anybody in the world would ever query. Hiroshi thought about it for about 4 seconds, which is the correct amount of time, because it's a genuinely good idea even without the crimes. How much for a card? We argued for 20 minutes about the discount. He won. He was right as well, which annoyed me, and that shop stopped being a ramen stall. It became a place where every important person in Konoha voluntarily came and stood still, within arm's reach of me, on a regular schedule, and gave me their name in writing. The other thing about being clever is that somebody always noticed something. A woo found me 9 days later. I was walking back through the North Wood at dusk and I felt it, and I want to describe the feeling because it isn't a sound. It's that the birds are doing something slightly wrong about 40 yards behind you. He'd been following me for 2 hours, and when he finally came out of the trees, he said something that turned my blood to river water. You smell like my brother's grave. Because Awu had Inuzuka on his mother's side. Not enough for the clan, not enough for a dog, but enough for a nose. And a 14-year-old boy had put a hand on the back of his head on a street corner. Days later, that same boy walked past him in a market, carrying the smell of a specific patch of burnt ground in a specific wood. It sat in him, and sat in him, until it made a shape. Where's Daichi? He said. I don't know who that is. You do. He came closer. He was crying, actually, which I did not expect. Everybody's dying. Everybody. Akihito's gone. Masaru Riku's people are asking questions. My brother's in the ground, and nobody will tell me who put him there, and now they're all dying, and it started when you… Do you want me to show you? He stopped. Daichi, I said, do you want me to show you where he is? And I watched a man make the last bad decision of his life for a completely understandable reason, which is that he had a brother in the ground and no answers, and here was somebody offering him one. I walked him 40 minutes into the wood. He talked most of the way, about Ryota, about what he'd been told, which was that his brother's death would mean something. He was a fundamentally decent person who had been used from the day he was born by people who liked him, and I let him talk the entire way because I did not want to think about what I was walking towards. We came into the black clearing. New grass coming up through it, that violent green you get on burnt ground. He's here, I said. Awu looked at the grass. Under it? In it. That's the grass on his ashes. And he turned around, and I saw him understand everything at once, and I did it before he could get the shape of his own face out. It was quick. I'm not going to describe it. He didn't fight, and I didn't enjoy it, and I have never once thought about that clearing without also thinking about a man crouching on a curb, making sure a stranger's kid could breathe. 4 days later, Masaru Riku was assassinated. Kazuki did it. Neat, professional, in his own house, and the police found him in the morning. And the Konoha military police, who had a letter in their captain's desk from an interrogation division captain saying Kageyama is doing this, now had a dead liaison officer. Jinbei stood up in a meeting and said, out loud, in front of witnesses, that the Uchiha would be taking this to the Hokage, and that if the Hokage would not act, then the Uchiha would, which is a sentence that changes a village. I was sitting on a wall about 2 streets away eating a rice ball when I found out, and I did the sums, and the sums came out clean. Root was killing the Cabal. The police were mobilizing against Root. The Cabal was watching its own people vanish 1 a week with no idea why. 3 separate powers in this village were now moving at full speed, and every single one of them was moving because of something I had written down, and not one of them had my name. I was going to need scrolls, though, actual official ones for what came next, and the Interrogation Division archive does not hand those out to boys on medical leave, so I walked into the archive and asked for them. That's it. That's the whole technique. I walked in and asked. The archivist was a woman of about 50 who had been down there long enough to have opinions about air. She looked at me and said, "You're on leave." I know. So why are you here? And I gave her a sentence. I said, because a man asked me the same question you're asking in this room about 26 years ago, and he was told that a reader who doesn't study his own division's history is a reader who repeats it. She went completely still, because that had happened. 26 years ago, a young Interrogation Division officer had come down for scrolls he had no clearance for, and had been refused, and had argued, and had been told exactly that by the man who ran the archive then. And I knew every word of it because that young officer had grown up to be my captain, and I had been standing in his office with 2 fingers on his forehead. She gave me the scrolls. She gave me the scrolls because I had accidentally quoted her dead predecessor at her, and she went and got them herself, and on the way back she said, "Nobody's said that in this building in a long time." I said, "No, ma'am." Then I took the scrolls home and wrote letter 3. Letter 3 was 1 line long, and it was the best thing I wrote that year. It went to Genshin, the old man with the garden. 20 years of patience, 16 men, never once suspected of anything. It did not accuse him. It did not threaten him. It did not have a name on it, or a code word, or a seal. It said, "There is a traitor among us. They have the list. Run." That's it. Now, everything I'd done up to that point relied on people being clever. This one relied on the opposite. This one relied on the fact that a man who has been perfectly safe for 20 years has never once had to make a decision fast. His people had been dying for 3 weeks, and he did not know why. He'd been going quietly mad about it. And then an unsigned note appears under his door in the night, and the note explains everything. A traitor, of course. Not an enemy, a traitor, somebody inside. Which meant that everything he'd built was already gone, and every man he could send for might be the one, and the only asset he had left was time. So he did what a man does when he has been the cleverest person in a room for 20 years, and is suddenly the stupidest. He created a distraction, and he ran. He had 6 men left, 6 out of 16, and every one of them had been in his hands since they were children, and had been worked on by a Yamanaka until there was very little left of them but obedience. He sent all 6 at the Hokage's residence in the middle of the night. They were never going to get near Hiruzen. He knew that. That wasn't the point. The point was that at 2 in the morning, the entire Anbu of Konoha would be looking at one building, and the gate would be thin, and the pleasant retired administrator could walk out of it with a bag. The house went up. I saw the glow from my window. 6 men who had had their heads emptied out for the convenience of a man in a garden died on a lawn without ever knowing why, and the village woke up screaming, and Genshin went out of his back door and walked calmly towards the north gate. And I was already there. I'd been there since 10 o'clock. He came up the road at a good pace, hooded, not running, because running is what gets you noticed, and he knew that better than anybody. I stepped out of the trees about 15 yards short of the gate. He stopped. He looked at me, and I watched a 20-year conspiracy try to make sense of a teenager on an empty road, and he said the thing they all said in the end. "Who are you?" I didn't answer. I put my hands together instead. The gate of Konoha is a big structure. I put enough water into it to take the left-hand post off its footing and put both of them down the road on their backs. And I want you to understand that this was not a fight. There was no exchange. He was a 60-year-old administrator who had not been in the field since before the Second War, and I had a body that does not spend anything and 3,000 nights of practice in a wood. I took his hands off at the wrist because he was Nara, and a Nara with a shadow, and 2 hands is a problem, and a Nara without them is an old man. He was on his back in the water with his hood off, and he looked up at me, and he was not frightened, which I respected. He was just furious. 20 years, 6 dead boys on a lawn, and it ends on a wet road with a child standing over him. "Who sent you?" he said. And this is the part I planned. This is the part I'd been planning for 11 days. Because he was going to be found. There was no version where a body at the north gate goes unfound, and the first thing they do to a fresh corpse in this village is put a Yamanaka's hand on its head, and the last thing in that head was going to be a name. So I made sure it was a good one. I crouched down, and I said, clearly, so it would set, "Uchiha Shusuke." Then I cut his throat. I want to be honest about something here, and it's the only place in this entire story where I'll admit I got something badly wrong. I did that because it was clean, because the police were already mobilized against Root, and the last thing a dying conspirator sees being an Uchiha officer's face put a rock in the middle of that road, and it slowed the whole village down by weeks, and weeks were what I needed. It was a good move. It was an extremely good move. And the man I hung it on was a 22-year-old who had bought a stranger's kid a peach and who told everybody, for years afterwards, that somebody had used his name in a murder and he did not know why. I've had a long time to sit with that. The next morning I went to work. Not because I had to. My leave still had 11 days on it. I went because a boy who is on leave during a crisis and does not come in to see if he can help is a boy somebody remembers, and a boy who turns up at 7 in the morning offering to do paperwork is invisible for life. They gave me a looter, a man who had gone into a shop during the fire at the Hokage's residence and come out with a jar of melon seeds. That's what the entire night amounted to on my desk. The village had nearly come apart. 6 men were dead on a lawn. An old man was in the road at the north gate with his hands off, and I spent the morning interrogating a bloke about melon seeds. He confessed immediately and cried. I gave him the water. I wrote it up, and on the way out at the end of the day, the notice board had a new sheet on it, and the sheet said that all Yamanaka clan personnel attached to the interrogation division were to report tomorrow at first light, no exceptions. Signed, Shimura Kageyama. He wanted every reader in the division to read the bodies I had made. There were 19 of us in that room at first light, and I was the youngest by 11 years. Every Yamanaka the interrogation division had. Standing in a stone hall under the Hokage's building that I had not known existed until that morning, in a row, while a man in a dark green robe with half his face bandaged walked slowly along the front of us and looked at each one. I had never been in a room with Kageyama before. Here's what nobody tells you about him. He isn't frightening in the way you expect. He doesn't loom. He's an old man with a limp and a bad arm and a voice like a door in another room. What he has instead is a total, comfortable absence of the thing that makes other people hesitate. He looks at you the way a farmer looks at a field, not with malice, with planning. He stopped in front of me for about 2 seconds. 2 seconds. I did the breathing. I let my shoulders round. I looked at the middle of his chest, which is where a nervous boy looks, because looking at the floor is submission, and looking at the face is a challenge, and the chest is the exact coordinate of somebody who wishes he were elsewhere. He moved on, and I stood there with my heart going like a bird in a box, because behind him, on 6 slabs, were 6 men I had put in the ground. Not personally. 4 of them Kazuki had done, on the list I wrote, but mine, in every way that counts. You will read these, Kageyama said. You will read them in threes. Each body will be read by every group. You will report everything, including what you believe to be irrelevant. Then he told us what he was actually looking for. 2 names. Yamanaka Daichi, and a civilian called Wu. I would like to tell you that I remained calm. What actually happened is that my entire body went cold from the neck down, and I stood in a row of my own colleagues with the 2 bodies nobody would ever find, pinned to the inside of my skull. Because Kageyama had the list, 16 names, he'd been working through it, and 2 of them had simply stopped existing before he got to them, and a man like Kageyama does not think, oh, how convenient. He thinks, somebody else is in my garden. 6 corpses, 19 readers, 3 to a group, every group reading every body, which is, from my side, the single greatest afternoon of my life. Because I did not have to be clever. I did not have to engineer a touch, or fake a cramp, or pat anybody's head in a market. The job, the actual assigned job, ordered by the head of Root in front of 19 witnesses, was for me to put my hands on 6 skulls repeatedly for as long as it took. 10 techniques, 10, in 1 day. Everything those 6 men had ever learned, and 2 of them were properly dangerous, and 1 had a shadow technique that I have used since in ways the Nara clan would not enjoy. And after every read, I sat down on the floor with my head in my hands for 20 minutes and let my group leader put a hand on my back and tell me to take my time. That's the part I want you to appreciate. I have never worked so hard at anything as I worked at being tired that day. The trouble started in the 4th hour, and it started with the group next to us. They came off a body called Yuya, and their leader said, out loud, in the room, he met Wu 2 days before. Wu told him he'd worked out who was doing it. Kageyama's head came round. Who? He said. It doesn't say. Yuya never got the name. Wu said he'd been to see that person, and he'd know for certain by the end of the week. And 19 professional readers turned back to their work, and one of them stood there, realizing that the man he had walked into a wood 4 days ago had told at least one other person that he was going to see somebody. I needed Yuya, not the version his group had, all of it, but I couldn't ask. Every body was assigned. A boy who asks to go back over a corpse another group has cleared is a boy who has a reason. So I made a distraction, and I made it out of the truest thing available, which is that I was 14 and everybody in that room had decided I was fragile. I stood up too fast on the 5th read and I went over, straight backwards, into a slab, and I took the slab down with me, and there was a body on it, and a 14-year-old and a dead man went across the floor of Root headquarters together in front of the entire interrogation division. The noise was tremendous. 8 people came at once. Somebody was shouting for water. My group leader was on his knees telling me to look at him. And in the middle of all that, while 19 people were looking at the disaster in the middle of the room, I got my right hand up onto the edge of Yuya's slab and my little finger onto the top of his head. That's all it takes, a finger, and I got it all. A Wu had gone to see somebody, yes, but the somebody was not me. A Wu, who had a nose and a grudge and 11 months of being lied to, had been slowly building a suspicion, and the person he'd gone to see was Daichi, 4 days before Daichi and I went for a walk in the woods. They'd never met. Daichi was already Ash. And the second thing, the thing that made me lie there on the floor of Root headquarters being fussed over and genuinely, silently pray, was this. A Wu had told Yuya that he had a smell, that he'd got it off somebody in a market, that he could follow it if he could get near it again. Yuya had asked him whose it was, and a Wu had said, I'll know when I go to his house. Daichi's house. Where I had spent 9 hours at a desk, where I had taken a cloak and a pair of gloves and a floor tile full of money, where every single thing I had touched was covered in me, and where a man with an Inuzuka nose was intending to go and take a good, long breath. The room came back into focus. Somebody was holding my head off the stone. It burnt down, said a voice from the other side of the room. I did not move. Daichi's place, the voice said, went up about a fortnight back, whole terrace. They think it was the lamp. It had not been the lamp. It had been me, on the way out at 4 in the morning, with a small fire in a paper basket, because I had read 140 criminals by then, and every single one of them had been caught by something they left behind. I had burnt a house down out of pure caution, and it turned out to be the only reason I am alive. I want you to understand that I did not feel clever. I lay on that floor and felt sick, because the margin had been 4 days and a coin flip about a lamp. Then I got up, apologized to everyone, and went back to work. The bad part came at the end of the day, and it was my own fault, because there was still a hole. Yuya's memory said Awu had a suspect and was going to confirm it. And every reader in that room was going to keep chewing on that until somebody produced a name, and if no name ever came, they would keep looking until they found me. So they needed a name. And a corpse is not a locked box. I'd learned that watching Daichi do it. A memory in a dead brain is a physical thing, and it is possible, with enough raw spiritual power, to put something into it. Not a scene, not a conversation, nothing that sophisticated. I had 8 months of stolen technique and 400 civilians worth of spiritual power, and I was 14, and it was like trying to write with a shovel. What I could do was one word. I put my hands on Yuya's temples, and I forced a single word down into the dead pulp where a name would have been, and I did it hard enough that my nose started bleeding, and I had to make it look like the strain of reading. Uchiha. One word. No first name, no face, just the clan. Which sounds crude, and it is crude, and it is also exactly enough. Because a room full of people who have spent 11 months watching the Uchiha get angrier do not need a first name. They will supply the rest themselves. The trouble is that one of the men in my group was called Kotaro, and Kotaro was very good. He went in after me and came out frowning. There's something wrong with this one. Wrong how? Said our leader. The word's sitting wrong. It's not attached to anything. There's no picture around it, no sound, no before or after. He rubbed his eyes. It's like somebody's written on the inside of him. The room got quiet, and I said, Isn't that just what happens when they're dead a while? Kotaro looked at me. The last 4 I did all felt strange at the edges, I said. I thought that was normal. Is it not normal? I've only ever done fresh ones and the ones in the cold room. And I watched a very good reader decide he was probably talking to a boy who did not know what he was seeing, and then decide he was probably not certain enough to stand in front of Shimoda Kageyama and say the words, "Somebody has tampered with this corpse." Because you have to think about what that sentence costs. If he says tampering, he is saying that one of the 18 people in this room did it, and then everybody gets read, including him. Maybe, he said, and he let it go. The group next to ours did not let it go. Their leader went to Kageyama at the end of the day and reported that in his professional judgment, the Yuya body had been interfered with. I watched him do it. I watched Kageyama listen and nod and thank him and take the man and his 2 subordinates through a door at the back. They did not come out. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean that 3 Yamanaka went through a door in route headquarters at the end of a working day. Nobody in our division ever saw them again. Their names came off the roster the following month with no announcement. Not one of the 18 people standing in that room asked a single question about it. That's the village. That's the whole village in one sentence. 3 men disappeared through a door in front of a room of professional investigators, and the professional investigators went home for their dinner. I have thought many times about whether Kageyama believed him. I think he did. I think Kageyama knew perfectly well that somebody had written on that corpse. And I think he had exactly the same problem I did, which is that the only way to find out who was to have every reader in the room read. And a man who has spent 30 years building a secret department cannot afford 18 Yamanaka going through each other's heads in his own basement. So he closed it. He closed it by removing the 3 people who had said it out loud. We read for 30 more hours over the next 2 days. I got 10 techniques and a headache. Nobody else got anything at all. And on the 3rd morning, Kageyama stood in front of us and said, "You are dismissed." And we filed out past 6 bodies and up a staircase into a village that had absolutely no idea any of it had happened. I went to Ichiraku that night because I needed to be around somebody who was not lying. It was late, nearly closing. I had the place to myself, and Hiroshi was doing the thing where he cleans a surface that is already clean because he wants the company but won't say so. Then the flap moved, and a woman came in and sat down 2 stools along, long black hair, Uchiha crest on her back. "One, please." She was maybe 20, and she did not look at me, and I understood immediately that not looking at me was work, because she had come in, taken a seat with a clear line to the door, and put herself on my right, which is where you sit if you want a person's dominant hand where you can see it. Himari. "You're the boy from the interrogation division," she said to her bowl. "I am. You've been asking about my clan. Now, here is my situation. A trained Uchiha has come to a ramen stall at closing time to ask me questions, which means somebody in her clan has flagged me, which means the peach and the market and Shusuke's name have all made it back to somebody who writes things down. The wrong move is to deny it. Denial is confirmation." "I have," I said. She turned then. "Why?" "Because I want to transfer." "To what?" "To the police." And I gave her, entirely straight-faced, the exact same lie I'd given Kai, in more detail, with better fittings on it. That I was in a department that puts you underground at 14. That I'd seen an Uchiha officer identify a body from the river and the whole village had talked about it for a week. That when you are the boy who reads the dead, a man who catches the living looks like the finest thing in the world. "So yes," I said, "I've been asking about your clan. I've been asking anyone who'll talk to me. If that's a problem, I'll stop." She watched me for a long moment, and then she said, "The interrogation division doesn't transfer people out." "No. So you're asking about a thing you can't have." "Yes." And I let that sit, because that sentence is true, and true things have a weight in the air that lies do not, and she could hear it. Then she said, more quietly, "Somebody used Shusuke's name." I heard. "Did you hear where?" "At the north gate." She turned all the way round on the stool. "How do you know it was at the north gate?" And there it was, the actual question. Everything else had been warm-up. She had come in here to get me to say that one thing, and she had steered the whole conversation to it. And she was good. She was genuinely good. And if I had been anybody else in that village, I would have been finished. I looked at her with the flat, bored face of a boy who has been asked something obvious. "Because I work in the interrogation division," I said, "and there was a body from the north gate with its hands off on my department's slab for 2 days, and every single person in that building has been talking about nothing else. Did you think it was a secret?" She held it a second longer. Then she turned back to her bowl, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch, and I felt about 9 years fall off my life. "Sorry," she said. "It's fine." "It isn't. Somebody's aiming things at my clan, and I don't know who, and I'm interrogating children in noodle shops." She ate for a moment. "That's not a good sign about how things are going, is it?" "No, ma'am." And then, because I am the way I am, and because the single best moment to sell somebody something is 9 seconds after you have made them feel bad, I said, "You should get a card." "A what?" Hiroshi did not even look up. 30 bowls, pay today, you save a fifth, 12 people on it already. She bought one. Uchiha Himari bought a ramen loyalty card off a 14-year-old who had used her future husband's name in a murder 11 days earlier, and wrote her name on it in her own hand and put it on a nail behind a counter I could reach over. Some weeks after that, Kageyama found the loose end I hadn't tied. Kazuki had been sloppy on Masaru Riku. He'd used his own insects, and one of the little things had ended up somewhere it shouldn't. And Kageyama, who had a dead police liaison, an angry clan, and a list with names on it he could not account for, put the two together and came to a conclusion. He concluded that Uchiha Jinbei, the police captain, was running an operation against Root. Which was wrong. Which was completely wrong. And which was also, from where Kageyama was standing, absolutely the only reasonable thing to think. That's the thing I built. I didn't make anybody stupid. I gave clever people true facts in an order that made them arrive somewhere wrong, and then I got out of the way. Then there were 2 months of nothing. I went back to work. I did my cubicle. I read pickpockets. I ate at Ichiraku. I trained in the woods at night, and I got quietly, monstrously stronger, and I did the paperwork, and Kenshin got worse at hiding that he was watching me, and I got better at giving him nothing to watch. 2 months. It was almost pleasant. And then, on a Tuesday night in the North Grove, I heard a woman scream. I want to be clear that I did not go towards it. I have never in my life gone towards a scream. I went sideways, uphill, to get a look, because the difference between those two decisions is the difference between the people who are alive at the end of this and the people who are not. I never saw her. I saw the trees move about 400 yards off and something bright go up, and then it stopped, and the whole wood went silent in the specific way a wood does when there are professionals in it. I turned around to leave, and there was a man standing 11 feet behind me with a kunai in his hand. Sunglasses at night, high collar, something moving under the skin of his forearms. Aburame Kazuki, Kageyama's right hand, the man who had worked through my list. You saw, he said. I didn't see anything. You are a Interrogation Division reader, out of quarters at midnight, 900 yards from a restricted operation. And then he was on me. I want to describe this fight properly because it is the only one in this entire story where I genuinely thought I was going to die, and because everything I had spent a year hiding came out in about 90 seconds. The first thing he did was mark me. That's what the kunai was for, and it wasn't a stab, it was a scratch across the shoulder. And in the scratch went about 40 of his insects, and now I had a Jonin's tracking colony inside my arm and no version of running that worked. The second thing he did was a clone. He came apart into a column of beetles about 4 feet in front of me and reassembled behind, which is a lovely trick and completely useless against somebody who has read the memory of a man who has fought the Aburame. I did not turn round. I put a hand back over my shoulder and let go a lightning clone into the space where I knew he was going to be, and I heard him take it, and I heard him not enjoy it. Then he poisoned me. He'd been doing it the whole time. That's the actual Aburame technique, and everybody misses it because they're watching the swarm. The insects in my shoulder had been in there since the scratch, and they were eating, and what they leave behind when they eat is not good. My arm went numb to the elbow inside 20 seconds. Then the numbness went for my chest, and then it stopped and started going backwards, and I watched a Jonin's face change behind his glasses as a 14-year-old stood in a wood and simply metabolized his life's work. Sage body doesn't heal, it doesn't spend. Poison is a cost, and my body had been quietly refusing to pay costs for over a year. What are you? He said. I want you to know that I did not answer, because I had spent a year building a person who does not answer, and because I finally had a use for the fact that he had come close enough to talk. I got my hand on his head, not a slap, not a con. I stepped inside a Jonin's guard, took the wrist that had the kunai in it, and put my palm flat on the top of his skull like I was checking a kid for fever. Ding! Dance of the Shikigami. Paper. Every sheet of paper in the world, moving how I like, in the technique of a woman in a country where it never stops raining, and it went into me in a wood at midnight with a man's whole life behind it, and behind that came everything he knew, and everything he knew was so much worse than I was expecting that I nearly let go of him. But first, I had to finish it. The Yamanaka do not only read. Reading is the polite half. The other half is that you can get into a person and take the wheel, and it is horrible, and it costs, and it is the technique that made my clan feared long before it made us useful. I did not have to make him do anything complicated. The Aburame have a last resort. When a member of that clan is finished, when there is nothing left and nothing to be gained, he can call his colony home and give them the only thing he has left to give. It is meant as an ending, a private one, between a man and the things that lived in him. I made him do it early. I let go, and I stepped back, and I did not watch. And what I will tell you is that it was over in about 4 seconds, and that it was quiet, and that afterwards there was nothing on the ground that anybody would ever be able to read. Then I had a problem, which was that there were still 400 of his insects in the air, and every one of them had my scent, and any one of them could carry it home. So I raised my hands and used a technique I had owned for approximately 11 seconds. Every scrap of paper I had on me came out of my pockets and went up, and then the pages of the report in my jacket, and then it kept going, and I stood in the middle of a paper storm in a dark wood and closed it like a fist. Not one of them got out. I checked for an hour. And then I sat down on a root, in the dark, with a Jonin's entire life sitting in my head, and I found out what the scream was. The scream was Ishida Sakura, one of the legendary 3, granddaughter of the man who built this village. She had been leaving Konoha that night, and Kageyama had known she was leaving, and Kageyama had not wanted her to. So he had borrowed 3 squads of Jonin from a man called Hanzo in the Rain, because a Konoha ninja killing Sakura is a scandal, and a foreign ninja killing Sakura on a road is a tragedy. And he had put them in a wood, and Kazuki had been running it. She'd got out. She's Sakura. Of course she got out. And in Kazuki's memory of the last few seconds before he came looking for me, there is a moment where she looks back over her shoulder at a shape in the trees, blonde, small, moving, and decides it's Asano Haruto coming to help, and goes. It was me, running away, sorry. And then, underneath that, in the deep part of him, the 20-year part, the part he had never said out loud to anybody, I found the actual thing. I found what Kageyama is. 26 years ago, there was an Uchiha called Jiro. He was on the second Hokage's own squad. He was the best of his generation, and everybody in the village knew what he was being built into. And one day, he went out and did not come back, and it was recorded as a mission loss. Kageyama killed him, personally, and took an eye. And here is the part that made me put my head in my hands on a tree root in a black wood. The old era men, Genshin and his 16, the whole 20-year conspiracy I had just spent a season dismantling, had started because of that. That was the founding grievance. They had believed for 26 years that Jiro's death was Hiruzen's doing, because Jiro had been a threat to a young Hokage's position, and they had spent 2 decades and every one of their lives working to bring down a man who had not done it. They picked the wrong target on day 1, and then were extremely competent about it for 20 years. And it did not stop with Jiro. Senju Hiroki, Sakura's brother, 12 years old, and everybody in this village said out loud that he would be Hokage. He died on a mission in the field, in a trap, at a place the enemy could not possibly have known he would be. Soma Taiga, Sakura's partner, the man who talked about protecting people and made other people believe it. He died of injuries in a way that nobody quite examined, and there were insects in the room, and Kazuki remembered the sound they made. Hiroki, Taiga, Jiro, not enemies of the village, not traitors, not obstacles to a plan, just the ones everybody looked at and said, that one's going to be Hokage. That's the pattern. That's the entire pattern, and it took me a wood, a corpse, and a year to find it. Shimura Kageyama has spent his whole life carefully, patiently removing the future. I sat there until it started getting light, and then, right at the bottom of it, in the most recent part, in the part Kazuki had been carrying around in his head that same week, was the list of who was next. 2 names, Sato Toru, the White Fang, the strongest man in this village who is not a legend, and the man half the population would follow tomorrow. And under it, the other one, Asano Haruto. Let me tell you where I started. I started 14 years old, in a cold room under a prison, with a dead man under my hand, and a plan that consisted entirely of one sentence. And the sentence was, be too boring to kill. That was it. That was the whole ambition. Take nothing, want nothing, hold nothing, and let this village grind past me for 80 years while I got old on a stool in the dark. And I did it. I actually did it. 12 months later, there is a 20-year conspiracy in 13 holes and a river and a road. There is a hole in root where its right hand used to be, and there are exactly 4 living people who know my name in a way that matters, and not one of them has the faintest idea what I am. I won. Completely. Nobody is looking for me, and nobody ever will. I just made one mistake. I sat down on a stool at a noodle stall a year ago because I was hungry, and an idiot with blonde hair sat down next to me and asked if I was okay. And now I am sitting on a tree root at 4 in the morning with a dead man's memory in my head, holding a list with my friend's name on it, written by the most careful killer in this village. Toru, then Haruto. Not soon. Kageyama's never done anything soon in his life. Years, probably. He'll wait. He always waits. So that's fine. That's fine. Because I've got a year of practice at being nobody, and a body that doesn't spend, and 400 people's lives in my head, and a wood I can put 1,000 of myself in every single night from now until it happens. And when the most careful killer in Konoha finally comes for the boy who bought me an extra egg, he is going to arrive on schedule, correctly, with a plan he has been building for a decade. And I'm going to be standing there,